Benjamin Studebaker. The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. The Way is Shut. Benjamin Studebaker. This Palgrave Macmillan imprint. For my parents, and for all. Contents 1. The Unsolvable Problem. Introduction. The competitive global economy and its consequences. The workers. The professionals. The employers. The trouble with reforms. The trouble with revolution. The resistance to giving up. References to false hope. The left's false start. The left as a hope industry. The right's rabbit hole. The right's obsession with culture. The center's quest for better gatekeeping. The inadequacies of Joe Biden. References 3. Chronic crisis. 2 types of fearmongering, 1 theory of crisis. Problems with Koselleck's theory. The chronic legitimacy crisis, an alternative model. Chronic crises occur when we get stuck in minimal legitimacy. Why purification reforms are confused with authoritarianism. Fear of authoritarian reforms makes gridlock worse. Encouraging localism. References 4. Dream eating democracy. Liberty. Equality. Group equity. Representation. Obstacles to restoring legitimacy by dream eating. References 5. No escape. The path to despair. Striving, settling, and sinking. Politics without politics. Faith. Family. Fandoms. Futurism. The American Subaltern. The Guys in the Hot Air Balloons. References 6. What if this book is wrong? Political prospects for would-be reformers. Intermediary steps. Economic endgames. Alternatives to democracy. The Paths of the Dead. Epilogue. References. Index. List of tables. Table 1. 1. Rising economic inequality, 1971 to 2021. Table 2. 1. The DSA succeeds only where Hillary Clinton is popular. Table 2. 2. Justice Democrats succeed only where Hillary Clinton is popular. Table 4. 1. Individual equity. Table 4. 2. Group equity, obviously unfair. Table 4. 3. Group equity, superficially fair. Table 4. 4. Group equity, superficially fair, racialized. Table 4. 5. Racialized equity understood in terms of the racial wealth gap. 1. Copyright the authors, under exclusive license to Springer Nature Switzerland AG 2023. B. Studebaker, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy https://doi.org/10.1007/978-3-031-28210-2_11. The Unsolvable Problem. Benjamin Studebaker 1. Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, University of Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. Keywords: capital mobility, inequality, class, democracy. Resentment. Introduction. The American political establishment takes the crisis of American democracy too seriously, but also not seriously enough. Many writers sound the alarm, warning about American democracy's impending fall. 1 to 5. They argue for different kinds of political reforms, all aimed at preventing populist demagogues from polarizing Americans along ethnic and cultural lines and manipulating the legal system to authoritarian ends. For Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, the bulk of the Republican Party is behaving in an anti-democratic manner. They think the problem is a lack of gatekeeping. Today's politicians can use the internet and cable television to reach voters directly, without going through establishment mediators. The primary system makes the political parties vulnerable to infiltration. But why do Americans gravitate toward the messages they hear on the internet and on TV? Why has public trust in so many elite institutions fallen to historic lows? 7, 8. The American elite is uncomfortable confronting the role it has played in alienating people. It chalks the crisis up to the spread of hate, to the spread of fake news, to the algorithms used by search engines and social media companies. But is this explanation really true? And even insofar as it is true, there's still the question of why. Why are Americans attracted to hateful messaging in the first place? Why do they believe fake news? Only a few years ago, it was possible in the United States to talk about the effects of the economy on democracy and culture. Mainstream liberal economists used to talk about this. In 2013, Joseph Stiglitz, who served as chairman of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisers in the 1990s, argued that democracy is in trouble because as our economic system is seen to fail for most citizens, and as our political system seems to be captured by moneyed interests, confidence in our democracy and in our market economy will erode along with our global influence. As the reality sinks in that we are no longer a country of opportunity and that even our long-vaunted rule of law and system of justice have been compromised, even our sense of national identity may be put into jeopardy. Stiglitz argued not only that the American economy was failing the American people, but that this failure would have political and cultural consequences. The problem, for Stiglitz, was globalization. He didn't think globalization was intrinsically bad, it was just that governments are managing it so poorly. A handful of Americans made similar arguments 10, 11. But things shifted after the 2016 election. Both party establishments were challenged by Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Each advanced a critique of the American economy. In response, much of the American elite closed ranks. Acknowledging the seriousness of economic problems and the role they played in fueling resentment gave aid and comfort to the populists. It was necessary for elites to find a way to explain populism without engaging with the economic context in which it arose. This was accomplished by setting up a dichotomy between economic and cultural explanations for President Trump's victory. It was either due to economic insecurity or cultural backlash. American political scientists looked at the income level of Trump voters 5, 13, 14. They argued that because many Trump voters were not personally economically insecure, economic factors could not be responsible for his victory. It had to be culture rather than class. But the economy and the culture do not exist in separate universes. The economy affects the culture. Voters don't have to personally experience economic precarity to feel that the economic system is unfair, that the political class is corrupt. They may think the economy has been rigged by greedy, decadent, hateful elites. They may think those elites are the product of a debased culture. They may look for cultural solutions to economic problems. If you talk about the economic problems, you get accused of legitimizing the grievances of the populists, of aiding and abetting the bad people. To avoid this, American elites have increasingly become trapped in an insular cultural discussion. They are too busy denouncing the deplorables to make any effort to properly understand the problem or respond to it. This denial of economic reality makes elites look out of touch. Ironically, it fuels the very resentments that drive populism forward. It's different in Britain and in Europe. Discussion of the structural problems with the global economic system still flourishes in the old world, 15 to 19. There are still deep, complex narratives that bring economic and political analysis together. French economist Thomas Piketty argues that economic change has undermined democracy by damaging the sense that the economy operates in a meritocratic way. Our democratic societies rest on a meritocratic worldview, or at any rate a meritocratic hope, by which I mean a belief in a society in which inequality is based more on merit and effort than on kinship and rents. This belief and this hope play a very crucial role in modern society, for a simple reason. In a democracy, the professed equality of rights of all citizens contrasts sharply with the very real inequality of living conditions, and in order to overcome this contradiction it is vital to make sure that social inequalities derive from rational and universal principles rather than arbitrary contingencies. British political economist Helen Thompson describes a process of deindustrialization and financialization that ends in cultural conflicts about the meaning of citizenship. Open international capital flows and new trade agreements made it easier for North American and European manufacturing corporations to offshore jobs to countries where labor costs were lower, and highly internationalized financial sectors concentrated wealth more intensely. Everywhere, democracies became from the 1990s increasingly unresponsive to democratic demands for economic reforms that would increase the return to labor. Under these conditions, democracies became particularly susceptible to their plutocratic tendencies and more difficult to reform. In the case of the American Republic, this turn fueled wider conflicts around democratic citizenship. For political economist Andrew Gamble, the United States is mired in a structural crisis, in which there are long-term and persistent deadlocks and impasses from which there appears to be no exit, and which lead to repeated short-term crises. If the economy is at the root of the crisis of American democracy, and the economy cannot easily be reformed, the crisis cannot easily be solved. This book takes the crisis of American democracy seriously, not by trying to terrify you about populism, but by engaging with its causes. It's a work of political theory, drawing on existing works of political economy. The first half of the book describes the current situation. The rest of this chapter lays out the economic context that drives the crisis forward. Chapter 2 explores the different ways different American factions have tried and failed to politically respond to the crisis in recent years, focusing on the cultural consequences of these failures. Chapter 3 offers a new theory of crisis suited to the situation described in the first 2 chapters. The second half of the book focuses on how the crisis may develop going forward. Chapter 4 theorizes about how American political ideas are evolving in response to the crisis. Chapter 5 explores what Americans will do to cope if the crisis continues unabated. Finally, Chapter 6 considers whether there is a way out. At the end of that chapter, you'll find an epilogue. It includes an extended discussion of how this book came to be written. The competitive global economy and its consequences. Often, when people talk about changes to the American economy, they talk about globalization. We are told we are in a competitive global economy. In practice, this means that there has been an enormous increase in the mobility of capital. It has become much easier for companies to move their operations from country to country. Increasingly, governments compete with each other to attract jobs and investment, and this competition creates powerful incentives to make policy that is friendly to wealthy individuals and transnational corporations. How did capital become so mobile? Over the past several decades, governments have encouraged trade by lowering trade barriers. Tariffs, taxes on imports, have fallen dramatically. In 1970, the ratio of tariffs to imports was nearly 5 times higher than it was in 2017. Between 1970 and 2021, trade increased, as a percentage of U.S. GDP, from 11 to 25%. When people think about the expansion of trade, they often think about outsourcing, companies moving jobs abroad. Outsourcing has eliminated some jobs. An estimated 3.7 million American jobs were lost due to the trade deficit with China between 2001 and 2018. But this is only one small part of the picture. Because companies can credibly threaten to relocate, government economic policy caters to them. The government worries about job losses, and it makes a point to limit them. Because of this, the problem is not so much the jobs we lose, it's the things the government does to keep the ones we have. To attract jobs and investment, our government stifles wage growth. It keeps the minimum wage down and it weakens the bargaining power of unions. The real, inflation-adjusted federal minimum wage was over $12 in 1970. Today it's stuck at $7.25. In 1960, over 30% of American workers were in unions. Today that figure is 10%. Between 1979 and 2019, inflation-adjusted wages grew just 8%, while overall GDP rose by 760%, 25-26. Technological changes reinforce these trends. The internet makes it easier for more work to be done remotely, making it simpler for companies to move their operations around. Automation allows companies to expand production without creating jobs or raising wages. Over the past 50 years, productivity increases have become completely detached from wage growth. Capital mobility doesn't just affect wage policy. It also affects the tax system. It's estimated that wealthy people have stashed between $24 trillion and $36 trillion in offshore tax havens. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Again, it's not about the revenue we lose, it's about the things we do to avoid losing revenue. Over the past 50 years, the government has filled the tax code with loopholes, undermining the statutory corporate tax rate. Taxes on corporate income fell from almost 32% of corporate profits in 1970 to just 10% in 2019. U.S. states have cut their income tax rates to compete with their neighbors, and they sometimes even use tax revenue to pay companies to come to town. 9 states are currently without a state income tax altogether, and on top of this, states and municipalities give away an estimated annual $45 billion to $70 billion in subsidies, 31. As revenue becomes tighter and tighter, states are forced to chip away at the quality of their public services. Across the country, average inflation-adjusted teacher salary fell 4.5% between 2010 and 2019. Teacher salaries in 2019 were 19.2% lower than those of comparably educated workers, and that leads to shortages. Many states try to staunch the bleeding by raising sales taxes and sin taxes, shifting the burden of supporting public services onto the backs of ordinary working people. 34-35. In 2016, Ted Cruz even proposed a federal sales tax as an alternative to the entire federal income tax system. With such weak wage growth, how can Americans buy enough to support the economy? With a shrinking tax base, how can the government pay for infrastructure and essential services? Americans need more money to buy more goods and services. If they aren't getting that money from wage growth, they have to get it some other way. Economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck outlines 3 different ways governments have tried to make up for persistently low wage growth. First, in the 1980s, the federal government ran up large deficits, propping up consumption by continuing to fund public services at a level beyond what revenue would support. In the 1990s, the size of the deficit became worrying, and the government instead began encouraging its citizens to borrow excessively large amounts of money, culminating in the subprime mortgage debacle of 2008. At this point, governments resorted to quantitative easing. As Streeck puts it, today's political fix is called quantitative easing, essentially the printing of money by treasuries and central banks to keep interest rates down and accumulated debt sustainable, as well as prevent a stagnant economy from sliding into deflation, at the price of more inequality and of new bubbles in asset markets building and, eventually, collapsing. Indeed, economic inequality has soared. Table 1.1. Table 1.1 Rising Economic Inequality, 1971 to 2021. Percentile in year 1971, percent, 2021, percent. Bottom 50% share of pre-tax national income 20.4 13.6. Top 1% share of pre-tax national income 11.1 19.1. Bottom 50% share of net personal wealth 2.3 1.5. Top 1% share of net personal wealth 26.3 34.9. The ordinary person has to try to find a way to navigate this increasingly precarious world. But there is no easy path in the 21st century, and most of the life paths available to people are likely to end in deep resentment. Let's explore how 3 different classes experience this new kind of economy: the workers, the professionals, and the employers. This schema purposefully simplifies things. Other factors apart from class, like cultural identity, influence any given person's experience of economic change and the set of political solutions to which they might be attracted. But by starting with economic class, we can more clearly see how the competitive global economy directly affects people's lives. Subsequent chapters will more directly address the cultural consequences of the crisis. The workers. For our purposes, the workers are the employed people who don't go to college and who answer to a boss. These are the people who, once upon a time, would have worked predominantly in factories and on farms. Many of these jobs have been automated or moved abroad. This has pushed more and more of these workers into the services sector. Many of them work in retail, food service, or hospitality. They are increasingly working in logistics, driving trucks, staffing warehouses, and delivering things. When more workers were in manufacturing, they were able to organize themselves politically with some efficacy. It is very costly to shut down a factory, even for a brief period, and this gave labor unions in the manufacturing sector a lot of leverage. Capital mobility took most of this leverage away. It became too easy for companies to move their facilities offshore, and this made labor unions more cautious. As manufacturing continues to employ a diminishing percentage of workers, more of them find themselves in service jobs where the strike is less effective. Brief disruptions to operations are not as devastating for many companies, and increasingly self-checkout systems make it easy for shops to stay open with skeleton staffs. Even when the will to organize is there, the government has made it steadily harder for old unions to survive and for new unions to form. Right-to-work laws frustrate unions, making it easy for workers to enjoy the benefits of working in unionized workplaces without having to pay dues. This makes it hard for unions to build up the resources they need to support their members during strikes, and that makes workers more skittish about using what leverage they do have. As unions' resources and leverage decline, they have fewer successes, and as their successes fade, they struggle to persuade workers to join and contribute. The unionization rate in the United States fell by more than half between 1980 and 2020. The unions played a pivotal role in politically organizing workers. As they have declined, the quality and quantity of worker political participation has also fallen. Political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson argue the biggest political problem for workers is the lack of groups that can provide a continuing, organized capacity to both monitor government policy and mobilize workers to respond to it. The unions were the core type of organization that did this work, and no clear replacements have emerged. Without them, it's harder to mobilize workers to vote, it's harder to fund candidates who prioritize workers, and it's harder to get workers accurate information about which candidates prioritize them. This situation understandably makes some workers feel politically futile, but many continue to do their best to understand what's going on. Unfortunately, as the unions decline, the information available to workers increasingly comes from media controlled by other economic classes. Wealthy oligarchs own the television networks and newspapers, and they use them to disseminate perspectives that are friendly to their own interests. While independent media offers an alternative to corporate media, independent media is largely produced by the professional class. The professionals, who have college degrees, do not always share workers' interests and cannot be relied upon to put them first. This leads some workers to reject both corporate and independent media, preferring instead to indulge in conspiracy theories. Statistically, lower levels of education heavily predict a person's propensity to believe in conspiracies. While conspiracy theories are often mocked by oligarchs and professionals, they are a way of trying to understand what much of the corporate and independent media refuse to explain: why the country is becoming increasingly cruel and unfair to working people. Workers who engage in conspiracy theories do not understand the changes, but at least they are trying to understand. At least they are able to recognize that corporate and independent media are not principally interested in helping them. Unfortunately, the conspiracy theories are no more helpful than much of the rest of the media. The workers experience the brunt of the pain and suffering caused by the changes to our economic system, and they resent the fact that politicians never do very much to improve their situations. But resentment in the absence of solid information is easy to misdirect. In their quest to understand what's going on, the workers are repeatedly pushed to blame various groups of people for changes that remain fundamentally opaque to them. While some oligarchs and professionals encourage the workers to blame out groups, other oligarchs and professionals accuse these same workers of being hateful and bigoted. In this way, the workers are pushed to adopt perspectives that marginalize them further from mainstream politics. The more the workers are induced to adopt hateful frames, the easier it is to justify and perpetuate their lack of influence. It's a vicious cycle of marginalization, in which a vulnerable population is repeatedly toyed with by people in positions of power and influence. There is, of course, one other option available to the workers: they can try to stop being workers. They can try to become professionals or employers. But this is not easy to do, and these classes face their own predicaments. The professionals. For our purposes, the professionals have college degrees, but they still answer to bosses or clients. They still rely on a wage, be it a salary or an hourly rate, for the bulk of their income. As conditions grew more difficult for workers over the past few decades, education was increasingly pitched as a reliable way out. More and more people went to college. In 1970, less than 17% of Americans between the ages of 25 and 29 had a college degree. By 2021, that figure increased to 39%. But as we've discussed, inflation-adjusted wages haven't been rising much. Even as the workforce becomes more educated, its wages stagnate. This means that while today's professionals do earn more money than today's workers, they aren't earning dramatically more money than the workers of yesterday. Social mobility in the United States declined substantially after 1980. Both intergenerationally and within one lifespan, 43, 44. More people aren't earning more money than their parents or their younger selves, even though they are often more educated than their parents and their younger selves. A third of college graduates, and nearly 40% of recent graduates, work in jobs that straightforwardly do not require a college degree. As the number of college graduates increases, more and more jobs require degrees simply as a means of thinning their applicant pools. In a 2013 study, only 27% of college graduates were found to end up in jobs related to their college major. Increasingly, people have to go to college simply because other people are going to college, and employers will choose the people who have been to college over the people who haven't. This is a costly distinction to obtain. Between 1975 and 2021, the cost of tuition and fees at four-year public colleges multiplied almost 40 times over, while the cost of four-year private colleges multiplied almost 15 times over. Student debt exploded. In 2021 dollars, the average graduate in 1975 owed just $5,060. Today the average graduate owes $31,100. If we exclude the 17% of graduates who manage to avoid debt entirely, the average borrower owes $37,113. President Biden has recently tried to forgive some of this debt, but tuition continues to rise, and every year millions of students take on ever larger debts. This results in a kind of indentured servitude. Graduates must acquire enormous debts just for the privilege of earning wages in line with what workers earned in the 70s. Once they graduate, these debts force them to take whatever jobs are readily available. Only a small minority manage to find careers in their major. The effect of this debt burden on young people is hard to overstate. In 2019, millennials held only 3% of American wealth. When baby boomers were the same age, they held 21%. Their share was 7 times larger. 7. Often graduates are forced to travel very far away from home in search of a way to pay down their debts. A full 77% of college graduates have moved communities, and only 24% of those mover graduates say that home is where they live now. This forced migration makes it harder for young adults to make friends and form social ties. Among millennials, 30%, always, or often, feel lonely, 53% have fewer than 5 friends in total, and 22% have no friends at all. Torn from their loved ones, many retreat into internet rabbit holes and unhealthy lifestyles. The COVID-19 pandemic intensified these feelings of isolation. A full 48% of millennials reported unwanted weight gain during the first year of the pandemic, with an average gain of 41 pounds, 53. Young would-be professionals are endlessly told that if they go to college, they'll have security and a real choice about what they do with their lives. The shocking reality for many is that they are acquiring debt for the right to earn a wage comparable to that of a 1970s factory worker, without the quality pension or the job security that a 1970s factory worker would have enjoyed. The size of the debt limits their options and fills them with a desperation that makes them easy to exploit. Their principal fear is that all of this hard work will have been for nothing. They'll toil for years, accumulate large debts, and end up in jobs that are little different from the jobs ordinary workers do. This, sadly, is the fate of many. We can make a distinction within the professional class. On the one hand, there are rump professionals who manage to get secure jobs in their majors and have the kind of life they envisioned for themselves when they made the decision to go to college. On the other hand, there are fallen professionals who are forced into jobs that are precarious, low-paying, or not in their preferred field. The fallen professionals are deprived of most of the benefits they were promised when they made the decision to go to college. All they have left from their university experience is their cultural capital, their familiarity with the symbols, norms, and language that educated people use. The more the fallen professionals are made to live like workers, the more they hold onto this cultural distinctiveness as a way of resisting proletarianization. 55. This means the fallen professionals are constantly drawn into pretentious discourses that exclude ordinary workers. The more a discourse excludes workers, the more that discourse flatters the fallen professional's self-concept as a highly educated person of taste whose merit and virtue have gone unfairly unrewarded. The rump professionals did not experience the same letdown. They are doing the jobs they hoped they would do, and therefore they are much less resentful. Most of the prestigious, influential jobs in politics, the civil service, the media, and the arts are performed by rump professionals. Rump professionals make most of the content that other classes consume. They often work for oligarchs and corporations, but most of the people who consume the content they produce are workers and fallen professionals. To attract an audience, the rump professionals need to cater to the resentment that workers and fallen professionals feel. But if rump professionals direct resentment toward wealthy oligarchs, the rump professionals will be directing resentment toward their own employers. This might get them fired. The rump professionals did not get to where they are by taking these kinds of risks. They were the honors students who followed the rules, the college students with the best networking skills. They have spent their whole lives trying to impress their parents, teachers, professors, and employers. In many cases they have internalized the values of these authority figures, making it extremely difficult for them to even articulate a critique of those values in the first case. Even when they can articulate such a critique, their priority tends to be on keeping their jobs and moving up in their careers. Therefore, most rump professionals must direct resentment away from their bosses and onto various social and cultural groups. They encourage workers to blame social and cultural groups for social problems, and they encourage fallen professionals to look down on workers for targeting those groups. In this way, rump professionals encourage a cultural antagonism between workers and fallen professionals, making it harder for them to cooperate with one another against the oligarchs. Even when workers and fallen professionals avoid swallowing these narratives, the rump professionals' emotionally intense content monopolizes public discourse and crowds out alternatives. Anger and outrage are enormously viral online, and the market rewards media outlets and political organizations that find ways to generate it. The rump professionals are, for the most part, unaware of the role they play in perpetuating divisions and drowning out constructive attempts to organize. Many of them genuinely believe in the values of their employers. They are so effective at creating and disseminating content that defends their employers' interests in large part because they have bought into their employers' worldview. This brings us to our next class, the employers themselves. The employers. For our purposes, the employers are the people who are their own boss, regardless of education level. Like the professionals, they come in two varieties. The small employers run small businesses, while the oligarchs own large stakes in the transnational corporations that increasingly dominate the landscape. The oligarchs are the primary beneficiaries of the economic changes we've been describing. Between 1971 and 2021, the top 1% of American earners saw their share of national income increase from 11.1 to 19.1%. Their share of national wealth, including their share of physical assets, like land, as well as their share of investment capital, increased from 26.3% in 1971 to 34.9% in 2021. The top 1% of U.S. households now own 15 times more wealth than the bottom 50%. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the net worth of American billionaires grew by 50%. Small employers are often encouraged to think of themselves as riding the same wave, but their situation is different. The median small business has less than 1 month's worth of expenses on hand. Because of this, even aggressive stimulus programs failed to save some of them from the pandemic. Almost 2% of small businesses closed permanently by April of 2020. Oligarchs can move their money all over the world, using capital mobility to get the best deals from governments. But small businesses are much less mobile. Your local restaurant cannot make hamburgers overseas or sell those hamburgers to customers across the ocean. Small businesses are dependent on local economic conditions in the places where they are geographically situated. When the wages of American workers stagnate, oligarchs can market their products to the emerging middle classes in countries like China, Brazil, or India. Small employers are tied to America's fate, and when American workers can't spend money, they struggle. As wage growth stagnates, the business models of many small employers become more and more dependent on ordinary Americans accumulating debt or receiving checks from the federal government. The small businesses that survived the pandemic did so with an enormous amount of federal aid. The Paycheck Protection Program, which loaned businesses money to cover their labor expenses during the pandemic, cost $800 billion. Most workers and professionals who try to become employers fail. Only half of new businesses survive for 5 years. Push it to 10 years, and the survival rate drops to just 1/3. Most of the businesses that make it stay small, 89% of all U.S. firms employ fewer than 20 people, and less than 1% employ more than 500. This means that most employers are in a precarious position. They aren't large enough to enjoy the benefits of capital mobility, and therefore they are constantly worried about the future of the country. If the living standards of ordinary Americans stagnate or decline, this very directly undermines the ability of small employers to survive. However, because small employers are themselves employers, they also worry that wage increases will hurt their bottom lines. This puts them in a contradictory position. They need American workers to prosper so that they can continue to sell goods and services to people living in their local communities, but their own precarity leaves them in a weak position to supply those workers with wage increases. The oligarchs leverage this tension, pitting small employers against wage earners, and therefore against their own customers. Through the media they own, the oligarchs argue that any policy that might restrict the oligarchs' growth will cause small businesses to fail. They argue against increases in the minimum wage and increases in tax rates, claiming that while they might be able to shoulder these burdens, the small businesses will buckle. The thing is, the very reason the small businesses are so vulnerable in the first instance is the weakness of American local economies. It is because oligarchs push down wages and push down tax rates that small businesses have a customer base that is so vulnerable and so inconsistent. In this way, the oligarchs perpetuate a vicious cycle, in which the increased vulnerability of American small businesses is used to get those businesses to support policies that make them even more vulnerable. Desperate to survive, small businesses often resort to wage theft. An estimated $15 billion to $50 billion is stolen from American workers each year, 64. Often employers fail to pay overtime, force employees to work off the clock, misclassify their workers as independent contractors, pay them with checks that bounce, confiscate their tips, and even illegally deduct their own expenses from workers' wages. Nearly 4 in 10 American workers report having lost wages in these ways. Most never come forward for fear of retaliation, and this makes it difficult for us to know the true extent of these losses. Apart from the oligarchs, no one is safe from the consequences of the competitive global economy. The workers straightforwardly experience stagnating living standards. The professionals compete with each other for a scarce number of lucrative roles in which they are often paid to produce propaganda for the oligarchs and corporations who employ them and fund their work. The small employers need American workers and professionals to provide them with a strong, stable customer base, and as that base erodes, they too are increasingly fragile. All of these classes are full of anxiety and worry. To make matters worse, the changes to our economic system are extremely difficult to reverse. There are some very serious obstacles to change that are too often left out of the story. Let's turn to them now. The trouble with reforms. The competitive global economy has strengthened the power of oligarchs. The economic historian Walter Scheidel observes that once extraordinary inequalities of wealth and power take hold in a society, they are only very rarely disrupted. Historically, peaceful reform just hasn't managed to get the job done. Scheidel identifies four forces that have shown a real capacity to substantially weaken or displace entrenched oligarchs: war, revolution, state collapse, and pandemics. But crucially, this doesn't mean that just any war or any pandemic will knock the oligarchs off their perch. The Iraq War came alongside continuous growth in the wealth and power of American oligarchs, and the COVID-19 pandemic increased the wealth and power of oligarchs more than any other event of the last 30 years. Throughout the Iraq War and the COVID-19 pandemic, global supply chains continued to operate, and capital remained mobile. These events not only failed to disrupt the accumulation of wealth by oligarchs, they accelerated it. In the face of events like these, the oligarchs are anti-fragile. They turn mild and moderate disorder to their advantage. When Scheidel says that wars and pandemics can produce leveling, he isn't talking about the kinds of wars and pandemics we've been having recently. He's talking about enormously horrific events like the World Wars and the Black Death. These events produced leveling because they were truly existential. The World Wars made it unsafe to move money and goods across the oceans. They made it unsafe to live and work abroad. The threat of losing the war enabled governments to impose large tax rates on oligarchs. The devastation the war visited upon Europe destroyed a lot of the oligarchs' wealth. Between 1941 and 1945, American top 1% income share dropped from 21.6% to 14.3%. In countries where the fighting was thickest, the drop was even more pronounced. French top 1% income share fell from 16.8% in 1940 to 8.5% in 1945. In the first few decades following the war, the oligarchs were unable to recover the large shares they previously enjoyed. American top 1% income share bottomed out at 10.2% in 1976, while France's share bottomed out at 6.6% in 1984. But today their income share is up to 19.1% here, while in France it's up to 10.0%. The world wars diminished the wealth and power of the oligarchs, but not permanently. From the very beginning of the post-war era, oligarchs sought to increase capital mobility by gradually lowering trade barriers. The first trade concessions came as early as 1947, when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, came into force. Further tariff concessions came in 1949, 1950, 1956, 1960, 1964, and 1973, culminating in the creation of the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1986. Top 1% income share continued to fall during much of this period, but as global trade opened up, the ability of the oligarchs to politically reassert themselves increased. The more the American worker had to compete with workers in countries like Germany, Japan, and China, the less leverage they had in labor negotiations with oligarchs. In the 1970s, at the peak of America's labor unions, oligarchs mobilized heavily to tilt the balance back in their direction. The Chamber of Commerce tripled its budget and doubled its membership between 1974 and 1980. Corporate political action groups quintupled their expenditures between the late 1970s and the late 1980s, diminishing the relative influence of the unions. The oligarchs founded new think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, and increased the budget of the American Enterprise Institute tenfold. The number of firms with registered lobbyists in Washington increased from 175 in 1971 to 2,500 by 1982. All the work that had been done to reduce the wealth and power of the oligarchs during the post-war era proved totally unable to withstand the onslaught. The vaunted unions were no match. While union membership did increase during the post-war era, the growth in capital mobility fatally undercut their leverage. When the oligarchs politically mobilized, creeping capital mobility put the wind at their back. The more the oligarchs pushed politically, the more the obstacles to capital mobility crumbled, and the more mobile capital became, the more effective the pushing became. It was a losing game for labor, and the game is still being played to this day. This hasn't stopped theorists from trying to imagine ways of reversing the trend. Thomas Piketty argues that if we could get governments to club together and agree on common economic policies, the oligarchs would lose their ability to pit countries and states against each other. He calls for a global wealth tax. The trouble is that global political coordination requires that many countries elect, all at the same time, politicians who are interested in pursuing this strategy. If some countries don't have governments that are interested, those countries can take advantage, offering oligarchs and corporations special deals to relocate jobs and investment. In each country, oligarchs are heavily politically mobilized, preventing the election of governments that might be interested in Piketty's strategy. It is difficult to get this kind of government elected even in a single country, let alone in enough countries to enable global or even regional wealth taxes. Consider the obstacles this strategy faces in just the United States alone. Because the United States has a federal system with 3 distinct branches of government, delivering political change requires a movement to win an enormous number of elections. It's not enough to win the presidency. The president needs the cooperation of both the House and the Senate. It's quite expensive to run even just one competitive federal campaign, let alone a large number of them, and many competitive campaigns still result in defeat. The president also needs state governments to cooperate, or for the Supreme Court to protect the president's agenda from their non-cooperation. If the president were to sign a treaty on a global wealth tax, that treaty would need to be ratified by the Senate. If the global wealth tax were framed as a mere agreement to circumvent the Senate's right to scrutinize treaties, Congress could refuse to legislate in accordance with the agreement. The election of a new president more amenable to oligarchic interests could easily scupper any agreement that is not formalized as a treaty. Other countries know this, and even a well-meaning president would have a difficult time convincing them that we would be able to keep our word. So, while Piketty's wealth tax would theoretically solve the problem, it lacks political feasibility. Piketty argues that if this kind of coordination proves impossible, governments might undermine capital mobility by returning to protectionist policies and imposing capital controls, limiting the ability of oligarchs to rapidly move money from place to place. But any presidential candidate who choreographs an interest in such policies could see an enormous amount of jobs and investment flee to tax havens and emerging markets between their election and their inauguration. To impose capital controls without risking capital flight, the president would have to spring them on the oligarchs as a surprise, without campaigning for them or establishing any democratic mandate for them. If the president imposed strict protectionist measures all at once, the protectionist policies would greatly disrupt supply chains, leading to inflation and recession. The president would be unlikely to politically survive, and the president's successor would probably reverse the measures. If the president imposed the protectionist measures gradually, oligarchs would have a chance to respond to the initial measures. They could push Congress to override the measures with legislation, or they could move money abroad before the measures kick in. If the president doesn't openly campaign on protectionism, the president is unlikely to have many allies in Congress who will support doing it. While some theorists offer policies that would work but would be enormously difficult to implement, others offer policies that are easy to implement but will make little difference. Very often in American politics it is suggested that we might raise taxes on the rich by a bit. Modest tax hikes on the wealthy are plausible, but they just aren't up to the challenge. To reduce top 1% income share to the level it was at in the 1970s, it's estimated we would need to raise the effective tax rate on the top 1% to 67.5%. Keep in mind, we're talking about the effective rate here, not the marginal rate. The top 1% would need to pay 67.5%, including any deductions and tax breaks that they might receive. The top marginal tax rate is currently just 37%. A tax hike of that kind would result in capital flight and extensive political mobilization by the oligarchs. Smaller, more feasible tax hikes have no chance of restoring the income distribution that prevailed in the post-war era. They are tokenistic measures, and even they are often opposed vigorously by the oligarchs. Many oligarchs hope to drive tax rates on the top 1% down even lower. Most efforts to raise top rates of tax are efforts to reverse new cuts rather than efforts to restore, even partially, the higher rates that prevailed in the 1970s and earlier. Elements of the left, the right, and the center have tried to work around these constraints. At least, they've tried to persuade us that they're trying. We'll discuss their efforts in greater detail in Chapter 2. But for now, it is important to take serious stock of the array of obstacles that stand in the way of reform. Global wealth taxes and robust protectionist measures require a stable governing majority the likes of which has not been seen in the United States for decades. Without such a majority, we simply don't have the credibility to push other countries to agree to major reforms of the global tax and trade systems. Even if such a majority comes into existence in the United States, it will face stiff resistance from oligarchs and corporations. As Wolfgang Streeck hauntingly puts it, unsatisfied demands of capital make themselves felt as disturbances to the economy. Elected governments seldom survive such disturbances. The trouble with revolution Scheidel does list revolution among his 4 sources of leveling. But there are lots of reasons to think revolution is unlikely. For one, as Scheidel points out, the revolutions of the 20th century occurred largely as a consequence of the world wars themselves. World War I precipitated the Russian Revolution. World War II brought the Maoists to power in China. Revolutions in other, smaller countries occurred in large part because the world wars exhausted the strength of the European imperial states, leading to power vacuums in their colonial empires. But beyond this, there is also a lack of credible alternatives to democracy. When revolutions happened in the 20th century, they happened at a time when Soviet-style communism had not yet been tried, or at the very least had not yet collapsed. The fall of the Soviet Union discredited not just its own model, but led people to question the very possibility of there being any credible alternative to our own system. In the wake of the Soviet collapse, theorists like Francis Fukuyama argued that the world was on the brink of an end of history, in which it became increasingly unthinkable to imagine liberal democracy giving way to anything else. More recently, David Runciman has argued that liberal democracies are in what he calls a confidence trap. Having successfully weathered many crises and defeated both the communist and fascist alternatives, older, more established democracies like the United States have become overconfident in their ability to solve problems. They let chronic problems fester, assuming democratic institutions will find a way to muddle through when problems come to a head. Then there's the extensive toolkit that American democracy uses to, in Streik's words, buy time. Whenever America's back is up against a wall, it passes a stimulus bill or incentivizes the private sector to allow Americans to borrow more money. If there isn't enough tax revenue or private credit available to fund emergency measures, the Federal Reserve rides to the rescue on the back of a wave of quantitative easing. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated just how little government needs to offer its citizens to keep them from getting ideas. Donald Trump sent Americans 2 checks, one valued at $1,200 and the other at $600. Joe Biden promised $2,000 checks and sent $1,400. Trump sent $600 in supplementary unemployment benefit, then cut that figure to $300 before Joe Biden eliminated it outright in September 2021. Much of the rest of the stimulus money went into the Paycheck Protection Program, in which the federal government subsidized employers instead of sending money directly to working families. These paltry checks were enough to get Americans to tolerate one of the worst recessions in history. There are theorists that like to compare the United States to other countries where democratic institutions have unraveled or suggest that American institutions are sliding in an authoritarian direction, 1-4. I'll discuss these arguments in detail in Chapter 3. For now, I want to emphasize that for all the noise about Donald Trump having authoritarian intentions, he was defeated at the ballot box. His attempts to stick around in defiance of the results received little support from America's political institutions. Congress verified the election result with the help of Vice President Pence. The Supreme Court, including the justices Trump himself appointed, rejected Trump's legal challenges. State governments did not cave to pressure from the president to alter the results, even in states where most of the officials were members of the president's own party. The military showed no willingness to help the president stay on. Many generals and officers openly loathed the president from the start, and he did not poll particularly well with active duty troops. It was politically useful to the Democratic Party to suggest that American democracy was existentially threatened precisely because of the degree to which so many Americans remain committed to democracy as a political system. While polls do indicate that more Americans are dissatisfied with our democratic system, dissatisfaction with the system has no relationship to support for authoritarianism, and a full 78% say that democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. Why couldn't Trump break American institutions? Democratic theorists argue that established democracies have inclusive, or impersonal, institutions, based on a rule of law, that prevent any particular section of the elite from putting down political roots. 73-74. American democracy is dominated by the oligarchs, but these elites are forced to compete with each other for preeminence through a set of institutions that are, by design, extremely difficult for any one section of the elite to dominate. Jeffrey Winters calls America a civil oligarchy. Its oligarchs cannot rule directly as princes or aristocrats, but have to project power through a mediating set of impersonal political institutions. These institutions push them into conflict with each other. Ambition is made to counteract ambition. If Donald Trump establishes himself as an autocrat, This is to the disadvantage of other elites who hope to one day win the powers of the presidency for themselves. Some Republican elites feel a need to be seen to support the president to get the votes of his supporters, but their willingness to support the president is predicated on the possibility that they can use the president's supporters to further their own ambitions. If Trump became an autocrat, these elites would lose the opportunity to fulfill those ambitions. The electoral incentive to support Trump therefore only lasts as long as elections continue to matter. The labyrinthine federal system frustrates both reformers and would-be authoritarians, and it often blurs the distinction between the two. When Franklin Roosevelt's agenda was blocked by the Supreme Court, he tried to pack it with new justices. Some theorists characterize the court-packing plan as an assault on democracy, and argue that its failure demonstrates American democratic resilience. But this is because these American democratic theorists largely buy the argument that the Supreme Court is a democratic institution, 76-78. In Britain, the House of Lords tried to frustrate government policy in 1911 and 1949. The government responded by simply reducing the power of the Lords to block legislation. Most British democratic theorists don't consider the Lords' reforms anti-democratic. For them, the Lords were an undemocratic institution that frustrated the will of the people. Whether a procedural reform purifies or distorts democracy depends greatly on your point of view. If Roosevelt had succeeded in packing the court, the defenders of judicial review might feel very differently about the court today. It might look to them the way the House of Lords looks to the British. But it didn't happen. Instead, when Roosevelt tried to pass his economic reforms, they were blocked by the court. When he tried to pack the court, he was blocked by members of his own party in Congress. Everywhere Roosevelt looked, there were more obstacles. Fukuyama calls this aspect of American democracy, vetocracy. Our political institutions are defined more by what they can block than by what they can accomplish. Even presidents associated with enormous legislative and electoral successes are frequently stymied. As long as Americans see no credible alternative to democracy and American democracy continues to heavily feature an extensive set of checks and balances, there is little chance of replacing the American political system with some other system. To be sure, this doesn't preclude the possibility of American democratic procedures being gently reformed, by changing the Supreme Court, creating new states, overhauling campaign finance, opening up voter access laws, and so on. But if oligarchs can block ordinary reforms that might threaten their wealth and power, they can just as easily block procedural reforms that might do the same things. We are therefore much more likely to get superficial procedural reforms, aimed at purifying our democracy, that in practice make little difference to policy outcomes. These reforms would be about shoring up our belief in the fairness of the system rather than about changing the kinds of decisions it makes. They certainly would not stop oligarchs and corporations from continuing to accumulate wealth and power at the expense of ordinary people. The resistance to giving up. These obstacles lead Scheidel to conclude that it is probably impossible to rein in the power of oligarchs. Reforms and revolutions won't work, and wars and plagues would cost us too much. He suggests we had better get used to this new world we're living in. If history is anything to go by, peaceful policy reform may well prove unequal to the growing challenges ahead. But what of the alternatives? All of us who prize greater economic equality would do well to remember that with the rarest of exceptions, it was only ever brought forth in sorrow. Be careful what you wish for. Scheidel goes so far as to suggest that high economic inequality is a default condition of human civilization. But while the middle part of the 20th century may look like a blip to economic historians, many Americans today still remember a time when economic growth and technological change served many of our people, rather than just the wealthy few. In the 20th century, we became accustomed to a world where wages and living standards increased rapidly, a world where people could expect their children and grandchildren to live more stable and more prosperous lives. A person born in the 1920s saw enormous improvement in working conditions and living standards by the time they saw early middle age. Even a person born in the 1960s saw a marked increase, with enormous technological change by the early 2000s. Young people born in the 1990s and 2000s grew up with parents and grandparents who believed in this world and what it could be. These people will not so easily accept the notion that the 50 years of falling inequality between 1930 and 1980 were weird, that the distribution of wealth and power that prevailed in the 19th century and earlier was normal. It's not as if things are standing still, either. The mobility of capital continues to increase, automation and technological development continue to weaken labor's negotiating position, and the gap between the oligarchs and the rest of us continues to grow larger and larger. How can we get used to a world that is becoming more vicious and more disappointing at such an alarming pace? Every new crisis sees a handful of billionaires grab ever more wealth from the rest of us. Workers, fallen professionals, and small employers all feel stuck in a system that doesn't seem to care about them or about how hard they work. They know it wasn't always this way, and they feel enormous resentment. This resentment is too powerful to be ignored. Too many people can win too many votes by feeding it. Too many people can make too much money by pandering to it. Over and over, politicians promise hope and change, or that the forgotten masses will not be forgotten anymore. Over and over, media outlets point the finger at different groups in our society, turning resentment into blame and hatred. They promise us miracle cures, offering us easy solutions to complex problems. Every time they promise to help, every time they tell us that some group is the only thing standing in our way, they raise our hopes and expectations. The people who tell us the problem cannot be solved, that there's nothing to be done but play by the oligarchs' rules, these people are quitters and they don't win elections or get clicks. They aren't competitive, and they're slowly going extinct. Instead of politicians and media personalities who tell us our system is fine, we will increasingly have leaders who tell us they know how to save it. Our elites know we don't really believe in our system anymore, but we also don't believe in any alternative to it. That means we have to believe there is a way to purify it, a way to make it deliver for us. It's the only way we can tolerate living in a disappointing system that we cannot escape. We are desperate to believe in an easy way out, and the elites who want our votes and our clicks will offer us a never-ending parade of false solutions. These solutions have to feel real, and that means they have to be credibly branded as radical, as rebellious, as forms of resistance. But because none of them can actually deal with our competitive global economy, none of them can deliver any real change. Each solution ends in disenchantment, and that means that the next solution has to modify the branding, to offer a different aesthetic package for the same old status quo. In the next chapter, we'll talk about some of the solutions that are being marketed to us by elites operating in different parts of the political spectrum. While some of these elites position themselves as part of the left or the right, their solutions all lead us back to the same place, back to a country where life gradually grows more brutal and ordinary people gradually grow more frustrated. Copyright the authors, under exclusive license to Springer Nature Switzerland AG 2023. B. Studebaker, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy https://doi.org/10.1003-3-031-28210-2. False Hope. Benjamin Studebaker 1. Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, University of Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. Keywords: the left, the right, gatekeeping, democracy, resentment. This chapter lays out how American politicians deal with the unsolvable problem. The core of its argument is simple. 1. In the long run, elected politicians need to prioritize winning elections. This is not to say that they don't have other values and goals. But politicians have chosen to pursue their goals through the electoral system. They can't pursue any of their further goals if they don't win elections. Politicians who do not prioritize winning elections tend to be outcompeted by those who do. 2. Because the unsolvable problem is unsolvable for the reasons given in the first chapter, politicians cannot get votes by tackling it. 3. If politicians need votes but they cannot solve voters' problems, they must find a way to get votes without solving problems. They do this by fostering false hope in a dawn that never comes. This chapter is about how American politicians get votes without solving problems. We'll talk about politicians from three different movements: the left-wing movement built around Bernie Sanders, the right-wing movement built around Donald Trump, and the centrist movement that is currently led, at least nominally, by Joe Biden. The left's false start. In the 2010s, it briefly looked like there might be a revival of the left. Bernie Sanders did much better in the 2016 Democratic primaries than expected. His 2016 campaign focused heavily around protecting ordinary Americans from the consequences of our competitive global economy. Sanders hoped to make healthcare, education, and employment more secure and more accessible. He promised Medicare for all, tuition-free college, infrastructure spending, and even a jobs guarantee. Despite the decline of the trade unions, Sanders was able to use the internet to raise an enormous amount of money. His campaign worked around corporate media, reaching voters directly through Facebook groups like Bernie Sanders Dank Meme Stash, and inspiring a fresh crop of independent outlets like Jacobin and Current Affairs. It also spawned a number of podcasts like Chapo Trap House. Even at the beginning, there were some questions. How far did Sanders really plan to go? Sanders kept a relatively low profile on foreign policy. He was quick to criticize U.S. military interventions overseas, but he avoided explicitly challenging the institutional structure of the global economic system. We knew Sanders wanted to revise trade deals to protect American workers, and we also knew he felt the United States needed to lead on climate change. But he didn't indicate any comprehensive plan to rein in capital mobility. Would Sanders bring back capital controls to stop the rich from moving their money abroad? Would he use American power to push other countries to cooperate on regional and global wealth taxes? Would he revise the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization? If Sanders had answers to these questions, he wasn't sharing. There were political questions, too. How would Sanders build a legislative majority in Congress? His fundraising techniques were sufficient to fund a competitive presidential campaign, but they couldn't support a national slate of candidates in down-ballot races. In the years following 2016, organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, Brand New Congress, and the Justice Democrats tried to offer support to down-ballot candidates, but they concentrated their operations in major cities. Sanders himself won primaries in many rural red states, with strong showings in places like Utah, Idaho, Kansas, and North Dakota. But only a handful of left candidates were elected to Congress in the years following 2016, and most of the winners came from Democratic safe seats in blue cities where Hillary Clinton was popular. Tables 2.1 and 2.2. Table 2.1. The DSA succeeds only where Hillary Clinton is popular. Members of Congress in the DSA district's 2016 Hillary Clinton vote share: Rashida Tlaib, MI 13, 78.8%. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, NY 14, 77.7%. Cori Bush, Mo 1, 77.0%. Jamal Bowman, NY 16, 75.1%. Greg Kasser, Texas 35, 63.6%. Summer Lee, PA 12. District created in 2018. Table 2.2. Justice Democrats succeed only where Hillary Clinton is popular. Non-DSA members of Congress supported by the Justice Democrats. District's 2016 Hillary Clinton vote share: Ayanna Pressley, MA 7, 84.1%. Pramila Jayapal, WA 7, 82.1%. R. O. Khanna, CA 17, 73.9%. Ilhan Omar, MN 5, 73.7%. Raul Grijalva, AS 3, 62.4%. Because most of these candidates represent districts with heavy Democratic majorities, they have little incentive to reach out to rural voters in red states. For them, re-election depends on keeping partisan Democrats happy. Partisan Democrats want their representatives to take polarizing progressive stances on social and cultural issues. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, has publicly supported defunding the police and abolishing both Immigration Customs and Enforcement, ICE, and the Department of Homeland Security, 2, 3. These positions consistently poll poorly, but Ocasio-Cortez's bright blue district gives her little political incentive to build consensus, 4, 5. By wading into wedge issues, these candidates have secured support from voters in their own districts at the cost of damaging their national appeal and the national appeal of the left as a whole. A study Jacobin ran in cooperation with YouGov found that the activist rhetoric associated with Ocasio-Cortez is dramatically less effective than Bernie Sanders' bread and butter economic messaging. This holds even among the racial groups that activist messaging purports to target. A majority of Black Americans want to maintain the existing level of police presence. Hispanic Americans do not behave like a unitary voting bloc in the first instance. If left-wing activists were members of the working class, they might have picked up on the unpopularity of their messages. But the activists are disproportionately college-educated. Many of them are fallen professionals. As we discussed in the last chapter, fallen professionals do not necessarily make more money than workers. Because their degrees have failed to translate into high-status, high-salary jobs, they cannot distinguish themselves from ordinary workers in traditional ways. They can only assert their superiority by emphasizing the ways in which they are culturally different from workers. Activist language is a language they learn to speak in college. Speaking the language becomes a virtue marker, a way of displaying moral and cultural superiority. This makes them extremely reluctant to abandon the language, even when it would clearly benefit the political movements they support. If they back away from the language, they must also give up the sense of moral and cultural superiority they get from speaking it. The psychological benefits of the language are, and I mean this with compassionate sincerity, too crucial to their mental health to be given up. Fallen professionals must continue to use this language, even though working-class voters experience the language as condescending and alienating. The language is so important to their sense of self that political defeat is preferable to abandoning it. Left activists are constantly looking for new terms they can use to remind themselves and others that they went to college, and this means they are constantly looking for new ways to alienate working-class voters. The more precarious the fallen professionals become, economically, the more they fixate on activist language. As things get worse for the fallen professionals economically, they become less and less able to reach out politically to other classes. Their movements become more insular, more defensive, and more politically hopeless. This is not the first time activist language has undermined the political growth of the left. In the late 60s and early 70s, George McGovern ran a campaign that was radical on social issues and foreign policy. His campaign pleased college students but alienated working-class voters. Between 2016 and 2020, the Sanders movement began to McGovernize, to pander to the cultural tastes of professionals, driving away workers with more moderate and conservative cultural stances. Professionals have more cultural capital than workers. When professionals and workers join the same movements, the professionals tend to dominate decision-making. Their tastes and preferences often win out, and the workers get marginalized. Organizations like the DSA work hard to prevent white men from dominating discussions, but it's harder to stop McGovernization. The distinction between professionals and workers is less visible and more easily blurred. Debates about the demographics of DSA often focus on race and income, but refuse to engage questions about educational background. Raising this issue makes people angry. It was hard to stop McGovernization in the 70s, when most college students still stood a good chance of having lucrative professional careers. It is even harder to stop it now when so many college-educated people are in precarious positions. Their economic and social vulnerability drives them into anxiety and depression. It leaves them with little choice but to sneer at ordinary workers as a means of salvaging what remains of their sense of self. Changing strategy becomes psychologically impossible, regardless of its political benefits. As the Sanders movement became more and more associated with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her squad, it became more dependent on blue cities and college towns where large numbers of fallen professionals live. It lost ground in rural areas, and it failed to break through with black voters in southern states. In 2016, Sanders won 32 rural counties in Iowa. In 2020, he won only 15. In 2016, Sanders won all of New Hampshire's 8 rural counties. In 2020, he lost 3 of those 8. By the time the 2020 primaries were over, Sanders had lost his 2016 pluralities in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, West Virginia, Maine, and Rhode Island. In exchange, he gained only California and Nevada. Sanders is aging, and his down-ballot allies are too polarizing to gain hegemony within the Democratic Party, let alone the country at large. As it has become more obvious that this movement isn't going to be able to deliver policies, some of Sanders' old campaign promises have fallen by the wayside. Even during the 2020 campaign itself, Ocasio-Cortez suggested that Medicare for all could be little more than a negotiating tactic to achieve a public option for health insurance. When the campaign ended, Medicare for all virtually disappeared from her Twitter feed. Sanders' jobs guarantee was downgraded to a human infrastructure bill. That bill, in turn, failed to pass. Eventually, Congress incorporated some of the bill's measures into the Inflation Reduction Act. But that act is almost 80% smaller than the original human infrastructure bill. It in no way amounts to anything like a job guarantee. President Biden showed an interest in making community colleges tuition-free, but he never showed any interest in extending this to 4-year public universities. Eventually, even the community college provision was dropped from the bill. What happens when a political movement is strong enough to win a handful of elections in fringe congressional districts, but not strong enough to produce anything like a governing majority? Its politicians have to find some way of appearing effective. They slowly shift the goalposts. They quietly abandon their transformative policy goals and instead offer their supporters the satisfaction of symbolic victories. Instead of fighting for big legislation, they fight to embarrass their opponents on television and on Twitter. They make viral videos. They work with the center of the party, because working with the center is the only way to win even small victories. They talk those petty victories up and present them as grand triumphs. Gradually, a symbiotic relationship forms between the Berniecrats in Congress and the Democratic Party establishment. The Berniecrats discipline the base voters, ensuring that they remain Democrats. By continuing to hang around, the Berniecrats give Democratic base voters false hope that one day the Democratic Party will move in their direction. The Berniecrats critique the party from within, and their critiques create an impression of intellectual diversity and vibrancy within the party. They tell the base voters that they will push the party to the left. If the base voters just work hard to get them re-elected, and to elect more Berniecrats to Congress, one day, they'll have the numbers to move transformative legislation. The base voters are kept on a hope treadmill, supporting the Democrats in the hope that the Berniecrats will one day succeed in improving the Democratic Party from within. That day never comes, and in the meantime, Berniecrats reliably endorse establishment Democrats in general elections. The Berniecrats discipline their supporters by fearmongering about the Republicans. They tell the base voters that Republicans are hateful bigots, even authoritarian fascists, and therefore the base voters must vote blue no matter who. If the base voters refuse, they are accused of aiding and abetting fascism. Bernie Sanders and congressional Berniecrats vouched for Joe Biden and urged their supporters to show up and support him, 16-17. They said they would push Joe Biden to the left, that they would make him the most progressive president in history. These were promises they could not keep and are not keeping. By performing this disciplinary role, the Berniecrats provide a service to the party establishment. In exchange, they enjoy long and lucrative careers as members of Congress, securing committee appointments and book deals. The party establishment welcomes their criticism. It is because the Berniecrats present themselves as internal critics that anti-establishment voters trust them. Their status as critics makes them highly effective at managing dissent. The left as a hope industry. Some people's jobs depend on the idea of a viable American left. These people work in politics. They work for campaigns. They write for progressive and socialist newspapers and magazines. They publish books with left-wing presses. They run podcasts. They work for think tanks. Whatever their specific roles, they get most of their income from political work on behalf of left causes. They are the professional left. For these people, the argument I'm making about the American left directly challenges the value of their work. It undermines their ability to raise money. If it spreads, this argument may threaten their jobs and their livelihoods. They have every incentive to resist the argument. They need to convince their audiences that the left has hope, because it is hope that drives people not just to vote, but to read, to listen, to donate, to buy things. The need to maintain hope forces the professional left to adopt increasingly strained positions. Let's start with an example. In 2021, there was a special election for a seat in Congress. The seat was in Ohio, in a district where Hillary Clinton received 80.5% of the vote in 2016, and Joe Biden received 79.8% of the vote in 2020. It's a heavily gerrymandered district, containing parts of both Cleveland and Akron. This is the kind of seat the left has been targeting. It's a Democratic safe seat. It's not remotely representative of the country as a whole. In the Democratic primaries, the left ran Nina Turner, a former co-chair of Sanders' 2020 campaign and the president of Our Revolution, a pro-Sanders political action organization. But Turner lost to Shontel Brown, an establishment candidate, 50 to 45%. Even in this very unusual, heavily gerrymandered seat, the left was defeated. If the left can't win in seats like this, how is it supposed to win power within the Democratic Party, let alone the country as a whole? Nina Turner is a signature figure within the Sanders movement. The left poured an immense amount of money and effort into her campaign. In February, just 6 months before the primary, Turner had $650,000 to Brown's $40,000, 19-20. Yet she still lost. How could this have happened? The result undermined the left's strategy. It challenged its narrative. Most importantly, it threatened the hope that pays the bills. This needed to be explained away. Writing for Jacobin, Luke Savage chalked the whole thing up to a late influx of dark money for Brown. Right-wing super PAC Democratic Majority for Israel, DMFI, alone spent over $2 million on ads mostly attacking Turner, and making no actual mention of Israel. Combined with another $500,000 chipped in from corporate AstroTurf Group Third Way, funds that poured in to crush Turner's campaign closed in on $3 million. A breathtaking sum for a special election held in the doldrums of late summer. If there's any lesson to be drawn from the Ohio 11th race, it's about the lengths to which the Democratic machine will ultimately go to defeat its harshest critics, and the lows to which it is willing to stoop. With the aid of big donors, some of whom were quite literally Republicans, centrists and party grandees successfully prevented the election of a left-wing progressive in a safe blue district. While the Turner-Brown contest may be an extreme case, the basic template it represents is almost certain to play out again as long as the Democratic Party retains its indefensible addiction to corporate donors and organized money. Special interests and lobby organizations spend millions of dollars on elections because those dollars usually get them the desired result. The trouble is that if this is true, it's not obvious how the left could possibly defeat the Democratic machine. Even modest campaign finance reform bills, like the 2002 McCain-Feingold Act, have been gutted by the Supreme Court. To change the composition of the court, the left would need to win the presidency and the Senate. To win the presidency and the Senate, the left would need to win elections. To win elections, the left needs campaign finance reform. It's a catch-22. But by blaming the power of dark money, Savage is able to divert criticism away from Turner's campaign and from the left's political strategy. To save the movement, he blames the system. Several months earlier, Luke Savage wrote a different piece for Jacobin. In that piece, he pointed out that campaign finance reform isn't enough. Canada has strong campaign finance laws, but Canadian billionaires still avoid taxes and Canadian unions are still declining. He wrote, "Restricting the power of money to influence politics may be urgent and necessary, but it does little to alter the ideological preferences of those who traditionally staff the halls of power." Which is all to say, the left cannot hope that fairer rules alone will facilitate its agenda or that liberal capitalism instantly becomes an easier environment in which to make gains once the nexus binding lawmakers and wealthy donors has been severed. If the left can't win elections under the current rules, it can't change the rules, and it wouldn't be able to win even if the rules were changed. Where is the hope? The professional left maintains the status quo by manufacturing hope where there is no justification for it. On August 27, 2021, Bernie Sanders held a town hall in West Lafayette, Indiana, to raise support for Joe Biden's human infrastructure bill. During the Q&A, one brave soul told Sanders his friends were getting disillusioned. What would Bernie say to those who feel disappointed, who feel that the American political system doesn't work? Sanders said his supporters should feel good, because people like Cori Bush and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been elected to Congress. He told his supporters they had already succeeded in raising consciousness. If Sanders has raised consciousness, and raising consciousness is good enough, why did Nina Turner lose in a bright blue, heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seat? If campaign finance laws have to change for the left to win, how can the left change campaign finance laws without winning? If campaign finance laws aren't enough to win anyway, why shouldn't Sanders supporters feel disillusioned? Why should they continue to give their hard-earned money to left-wing organizations that have no viable strategy to win power? The professional left has no good answers to these questions. Each time one of them is asked, it responds by shifting the goalposts. Challenge the strategy, and they blame the system for electoral defeats. Point out flaws in the system, and they credit the strategy with raising consciousness. Whatever the cost, the strategy must be protected, because the strategy is the cow that keeps on giving. The strategy is what pays the bills. But the strategy makes no sense politically. There aren't enough Democratic safe seats to give the left a governing majority, even if it started winning those seats consistently, and the left isn't winning even those seats consistently. The harder it tries to win these races, the more it caters to a fringe minority of voters, and the harder it is for the left to compete nationally in more competitive races. Even if the strategy were working, it would fail. It's not as if this critique applies to every member of the professional left across the board. In that Jacobin, YouGov study, there was an acknowledgement that activist language is counterproductive at the national level. If you asked them in a vacuum, many of these people might very well agree that left-wing campaigns shouldn't alienate people, that they should speak to universal economic needs. But in practice, the left continues to run the bulk of its candidates in heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats. As long as it does that, its candidates will continue to pander to the activists who dominate the political scene in those safe seats, and those candidates will poison the well for other left-wing candidates in other areas who try other approaches. The people who work in left-wing media have to find some way to attract an audience despite those defeats. The Sanders movement gave birth to a whole cottage industry, and this industry is desperately trying to survive, even as the political movement dies. To keep going, it needs to generate hope while keeping expectations manageable. Wherever possible, it emphasizes its ability to raise consciousness, playing up the significance of its cultural impact. At the same time, it constantly emphasizes the structural obstacles it faces: dark money, voter suppression, the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court. Every victory, however small, is evidence of its ostensibly transformational cultural impact. Every defeat, however large, is just one more reminder that the system is implacably corrupt. But if you look closely, you'll see that the left isn't just failing in America, it's failing in European countries that have many of the procedural reforms it calls for. There are European countries with proportional representation, unicameral legislatures, weak or non-existent judicial review, strong campaign finance laws, and high levels of voter participation. But all of these countries remain trapped in our competitive global economy. Even in France and Germany, economic inequality is rising, 23-24. Left-wing writers know this, and they endlessly lament the slow erosion of social programs and safety nets abroad. Jacobin is routinely full to bursting with articles about how the European left is failing, 25-30. They've even published many pieces on the slow decline of Scandinavian social programs, 31-34. Yet at the same time, left-wing writers argue over and over for the adoption of European democratic procedures. It's a dead end hiding in plain sight. The right's rabbit hole. Unlike Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump actually became president. For that reason alone, the right appears more politically successful than the left. It is also useful for both the left and the center to portray the right as successful. If the right is succeeding, then it is threatening. Fear is hope's counterpart, for fear relies on the idea that the enemy's hope is well-founded. But what would it mean for the right to succeed? During the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump promised to repatriate manufacturing jobs to the United States by embracing a policy of protectionism. But the jobs never came back. In 1979, 8.66% of Americans worked in manufacturing. When Trump took office in 2017, 3.78% of Americans held manufacturing jobs. When he left office in 2021, the figure was 3.67%. The total number of manufacturing jobs peaked in 1979 at 19.5 million. In January 2017, there were 12.3 million left. In January 2021, there were just 12.2 million. Even before the coronavirus, in January 2020, there were only 12.7 million manufacturing jobs. At no point did the number of manufacturing jobs come within sniffing distance of the pre-2008 level, 13.7 million, let alone the 1979 peak. This is not to say that the Trump administration did nothing to make good on its promises. Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. He renegotiated NAFTA. He imposed tariffs on 2/3 of Chinese imports. But for all the sound and fury, these policies did not even begin to make a real dent. All told, America imported 3.4% more in 2020, during the height of the pandemic, than it imported in 2016. During the same period, the trade deficit grew by almost 15%. Goods imports from China fell 6%, but they rose 88% in Vietnam. The jobs didn't come back. They slid down the coast, from Shanghai to Saigon. When the coronavirus hit, the administration had an opportunity to escalate its protectionist agenda. Supply chains were already being disrupted by lockdowns. If the administration had acted to restructure the global economic system, it could have blamed the economic fallout on the pandemic. But instead, the administration became increasingly worried about re-election. There were no new tariffs on Chinese imports in 2020, and the tariff rate was slightly reduced. Donald Trump also promised to clamp down on tax avoidance by billionaires, even pledging to raise taxes on himself. This, of course, never happened. Instead, the race to the bottom on taxes accelerated. Trump cut the top rate of individual income tax from 39.6% to 37%. He cut the top rate of corporate income tax from 35% to 21%. The federal deficit increased, as a percent of GDP, from 3.4% in 2017 to 4.6% in 2019. Before ballooning to 15% in 2020 during the pandemic. The administration argued these cuts were necessary to bring back manufacturing jobs. But those jobs never returned, and the cuts eroded the government's future ability to invest in infrastructure and support public services. The Trump administration promised to make major investments in infrastructure, but it was never able to come up with the money. The administration repeatedly found that congressional Republicans were only intermittently interested in working with it. The party establishment was happy to support tax cuts. George W. Bush cut taxes when he became president, and Mitt Romney promised tax cuts in 2012. But when the president needed votes for infrastructure, he could never find them. Opposition from libertarians was especially fierce. They loved free trade, hated government spending, and loathed Trump. His tariffs were constantly undermined by their threats of rebellion. Trump struggled to deal with Republicans in Congress despite a long and bitter struggle by Tea Party activists to replace establishment, Reno's, Republicans in name only, with more aggressive conservatives. Starting in 2010, Tea Party candidates funded by wealthy billionaires stormed through Republican primaries, unseating Republicans' base voters considered too soft. These primary challenges within the Republican Party were much more successful than the Bernicrat primary challenges of 2018 and 2020. There are a significant number of sitting U.S. senators whose careers began with a Tea Party-backed primary bid, including Scott Brown, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Deb Fischer. But they were not enough to give the Trump administration much in the way of legislative accomplishments. The problem was twofold. First, some establishment Republicans managed to survive the Tea Party uprising. When Donald Trump tried to repeal and replace Obamacare, John McCain and Lisa Murkowski were both still in the Senate to vote against him. Murkowski was beaten in a Republican primary in 2010, but she refused to drop out of the race. She ran as a write-in candidate and won the general election. McCain was challenged in both the 2010 and 2016 GOP primaries, but prevailed both times. The second problem is that it is not at all obvious which Republicans are genuinely anti-establishment. In the 2016 Republican presidential primaries, Donald Trump was competing against multiple candidates who began their careers as Tea Party darlings. Republican primary voters chose Trump in part because they did not feel they could trust the others. Tea Party candidates got the support of Republican base voters by taking provocative positions on social and cultural issues, but on economic issues they are difficult to meaningfully distinguish from establishment. Republicans. All of the competitive Republican candidates proposed tax cuts of one kind or another. All of the competitive Republican candidates claimed to oppose Obamacare. Trade is the issue where Trump stood out. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio both joined Jeb Bush in opposing tariffs on China during the Republican debates. Both argued that the United States should instead cut taxes to attract capital. Rubio was very open about this. We are all frustrated with what China is doing. I think we need to be very careful with tariffs, and here's why. China doesn't pay the tariff, the buyer pays the tariff. If you send a tie or a shirt made in China into the United States and an American goes to buy it at the store and there's a tariff on it, it gets passed on in the price to the consumer. So, I think the better approach, the best thing we can do to protect ourselves against China economically is to make our economy stronger, which means reversing course from all the damage Barack Obama is doing to this economy. It begins with tax reform. Let's not have the most expensive business tax rate in the world. Cruz explicitly opposed tariffs. You know, I sat down with the senior leadership of John Deere. They discussed how hard it is to sell tractors in China because all the regulatory barriers. They're protectionist. But Jeb is also right that, if we just impose a tariff, they'll put reciprocal tariffs, which will hurt Iowa farmers and South Carolina producers and 20% of the American jobs that depend on exports. So, the way you do it is you pass a tax plan like the tax plan I've introduced. A simple flat tax, 10% for individuals, and a 16% business flat tax. Neither of these Tea Party Republicans was actually proposing to challenge the global economic order. Instead, both were looking to follow the incentives that the system dictates. Both argued for continuing to cut taxes to attract investment, not as a complement to a protectionist trade policy, but as an alternative to it. Protectionism is the core element of the right's response to the unsolvable problem. Strip it away, and the Republican Party is just another vehicle for the globalism it purports to oppose. The right appears electorally successful, insofar as Republicans who style themselves as Tea Party or pro-Trump have won elections. But in practice, very few of these Republicans actually support challenging the power of oligarchs and corporations. Like the Bernicrats, they maintain their bona fides by taking provocative social and cultural stances. Like the Bernicrats, their opposition to the party establishment makes their party look more dynamic than it really is. They serve the status quo. They suck their supporters into an endless series of trivial struggles, never touching the economic system that is at the root of so many people's resentment and misery. The right's obsession with culture. It is well established that there is a large market for right-wing content, and that many of the people who operate in this market are hucksters out to make a buck. It was the right that pioneered the use of cable news to reach enormous audiences. The Christian televangelists led the first wave of mass media political entertainers. They paved the way for liberal comedians and progressive provocateurs. While much of the left still deny the degree to which it has become an industry, the right has a greater level of self-awareness. It is no sin in right-wing circles to run a business, and there is no need to pretend right-wing outlets are immune to the pull of the market. What is distinctive about the right is the degree to which it avoids engaging directly with economic problems. Wherever possible, the right advances decadence narratives. They go something like this: in the good old days, Americans were virtuous. Then, everything changed when the progressives attacked. We abandoned traditional values. We succumbed to the pleasures of sex, drugs, and rap music. We lost our work ethic. We lost our competitive edge. For Christopher Lasch, we became vapid narcissists, interested only in advancing ourselves. For Samuel Huntington, we allowed our values to be eroded by immigrants and refugees who fundamentally could not understand our culture or adapt to it. For Victor Hansen, we lost our commitment to citizenship, instead identifying with groups or humanity more broadly. In all of these narratives, Americans lose their commitment to America, replacing it with a commitment to the self, the racial or cultural group, or global notions of humanity. These writers call for a return to some notion of a distinctly American way of life. They frame their project as one of moral or spiritual renewal. Conservative books, programs, and organizations directly comment on the moral and spiritual life of America, and therefore they themselves are pitched as the antidote to American moral decay. They are cultural solutions to what is framed as a cultural problem. Right-wing commentators argue that we are individually responsible for the condition of the United States. We are morally and spiritually failing. By admonishing us, these conservatives are hoping they can get us to make better decisions. In their view, we have an individual responsibility to resist vice, and therefore to resist an increasingly fallen culture. We could acknowledge and perform our duty to defend some notion of American values. We choose not to, and therefore we are corrupt and decadent. We should feel bad about that, and do better. By starting from the individual, this kind of argument conceals the background conditions that heavily structure individual decisions. In our discussion in Chapter 1, we laid out how the global economic system subjects people of nearly all classes and backgrounds to enormous amounts of psychological stress. People look for relief wherever they can find it. They retreat into pleasurable distractions and they look for enemies to blame. Few, if any, have the time, the energy, or the psychological capacity to engage in conservative self-improvement projects. To improve the culture, we would need an economic system that makes a better culture possible. We would need to be able to solve the unsolvable problem. By shifting attention away from the economic system and back onto the individual, the right aids and abets that system. If we blame ourselves for the consequences of the system, we are not just distracting ourselves from the real source of the problem. We are asking ourselves to transcend our context, to be better than the situation allows. This requires us to believe we can do things we cannot do. When we fail to do things we think we should have been able to do, we become angry with ourselves. Conservatives hold themselves to unrealistically high standards. They think they should have enough personal virtue to be successful regardless of the circumstances. Even if they're willing to concede that the odds are stacked against them, they still think that if they were good enough, they'd beat the odds. When they fail, they feel like failures. To get relief from self-hatred, they fall into blaming cultural elites for the temptations they feel led them astray. For conservatives, the success of the oligarchs proves that those who don't succeed are caught in vice. People who fail are lazy and self-indulgent. They lack toughness. They are dominated by sloth, gluttony, and lust. These vices are encouraged by popular culture. The culture war is a war against vice, and therefore a war against our limitations. For the conservatives, when we learn to overcome vice, we will succeed economically, regardless of the structural impediments. Victory in the culture war will lead to economic victory for individual Americans and for America as a whole. Therefore, the culture war is the economic strategy, and the Trump administration's superficial cultural victories are more important than its discrete economic failures. This circular thinking allows the right to fight an unwinnable culture forever war, without seriously grappling with the economic conditions that make that war unwinnable. In a world where most businesses fail, the professional class is shrinking, and workers' living standards are stagnating, only a handful of people will be economically successful, regardless of how hard everyone works or how much virtue everyone has. Indeed, most businesses in the United States profit from vice. They sell food to the gluttonous, sex to the lustful, and petty distractions to those dominated by sloth. Business depends on decadence. The right's doomed efforts to win culturally trigger a more powerful progressive reaction. Progressive cultural narratives are similar to the conservative narratives in structure. They move attention away from the economy, instead focusing attention on the proliferation of vice. But where the conservatives are concerned with traditional vices, the progressives are concerned with the vices of racism, sexism, and various phobias. Where the conservatives are interested in creating some notion of a united virtuous American society, the progressives are interested in emphasizing a patchwork of overlapping identities grounded on race, gender, sexuality, and on personal tastes. Progressive political theorist Iris Marion Young defined social groups this way. A social group is a collective of persons differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, or way of life. Members of a group have a specific affinity with one another because of their similar experience or way of life, which prompts them to associate with one another more than with those not identified with the group, or in a different way. In some ways, the progressive movement fits much better with the market. It treats our desires not as vices to be reined in, but as fundamental constituents of our way of life, and therefore of our identity. For traditionalists, the progressives are actively celebrating vices by encouraging people to identify with their worst qualities. The gluttonous are entitled to feel pride and to think of themselves as part of a social group. They're foodies, or people of size. For Young, what unites us is not a shared commitment to the American political system or to some traditional understanding of a virtuous life. We are only united insofar as we are committed to affirming the validity of other groups. In this vision, the good society does not eliminate or transcend group difference. Rather, there is equality among socially and culturally differentiated groups, who mutually respect one another and affirm one another in their differences. Traditionalists cannot accept this. On Young's view, if we are part of a social group that is constructed around some shared desire, when we buy things we desire, we aren't indulging vices. We are celebrating our identity, because our desires are an important part of who we are. Every social group rooted in desire is okay, as long as it respects other social groups, as long as it accepts the validity of other groups' desires. Insofar as the traditionalists are interested in disciplining desire writ large, they cannot be reconciled with this. Today's conservative identity is constituted in part by the desire to negate other people's desires, and therefore other people's identities. The conservative cannot affirm others in their differences because the conservative has a desire to reject the desires of others, and therefore to reject the ways of life that constitute other people's social groups. It is for these reasons that progressives tend to regard traditionalists as not just mistaken, but fundamentally evil. For progressives, they are part of a social group that is grounded on negating the validity of other social groups. The progressive movement has a narrative about why desire is not just okay, but an important part of who we are. That narrative allows people to feel good about acting on their desires, and therefore it allows them to feel good about consumerism. Consumption is an important way of coping with the stresses visited upon us by the economic system. People need to consume to get through the day, and they need to feel that this consumption is, at the very least, permissible. The progressive movement tells them they are not only acting permissibly, but that by having desires they are succeeding in a project of identity construction. The more the right challenges the legitimacy of desire, the more the progressive movement will emphasize the importance of desire in constructing identity. The economic system makes us psychologically dependent on consumerism as a coping mechanism. It makes us dependent on our desires. If the right really wants to rein in desire and create a more virtuous society, it needs to create the conditions in which it is possible for the desire to be reined in. This requires that the right seriously commit to changing the economic system to relieve the stress that pushes people to retreat into pleasure-seeking and into worldviews that validate pleasure-seeking. This is difficult for the right to do, for two reasons. First, it requires that the right overcome its own pride. Conservatives want to believe that they are individually strong enough to overcome our fallen culture through personal virtue. They want to believe that an individual can be better than their society. They want to think that when individuals fail economically, it is their own fault, and when they succeed it is to their credit. This is a conceit, and the right needs the humility to recognize it as such. Economic incentives are really powerful, and no amount of grit or personal discipline can free us from them. But conservatives struggle to drop the conceit, because secondly, and more fundamentally, right-wing media is a consumer product created for the purpose of validating the capital C, conservative, identity. It does not exist to advance small c, conservative, political goals. The conservative wants to rein in desire, but the conservative has an identity that is itself rooted in desire. If progressives are overcome by gluttony, sloth, and lust, the conservative is overcome by wrath and envy. The conservatives are angry that they have lost control over American culture, and they are envious of the liberal cultural elites whom they believe exercise control. The conservatives want to see those liberal elites ruined. Failing that, they want to see those elites mocked and triggered. They want to drink liberal tears. Right-wing media constructs the conservative identity around the validation of this desire to rage against progressive social groups. It turns conservatism into the very thing progressives accuse it of being, a social group that is constituted principally by the desire to deny other social groups the affirmation they seek. This happens because right-wing commentators are themselves subject to economic incentives. The economic system subjects everyone, including conservatives, to stress and anxiety. It fosters resentment in them. That resentment makes conservatives highly susceptible to the conservative identity. Only by encouraging conservatives to become conservatives can right-wing media attract and keep its audience. If right-wing content creators don't play this game, the audience moves on. Donald Trump did not win the trade war, but he never stopped fighting the culture war, and it is for his efforts in the culture war that he remains well loved by his supporters. He continues to taunt and trigger the liberals, and the conservative audience is too beaten down by economic conditions to resist the catharsis of it. The right therefore faces powerful market incentives to follow a culture war strategy that only invites progressive backlash. The progressive backlash, in turn, further inflames the conservative desire to wage culture war, making it even harder for right-wing politicians and media outlets to offer anything else. The economic system generates miserable conditions that generate a conservative identity, and that identity crowds out conservatism. The center's quest for better gatekeeping. The center of politics is the place where compromises are made. Compromises are made by parties that disagree with one another, but not very much. Centrists can compromise because they are largely content with the way things are. They don't believe our economic system needs to change very much. They may think it needs a few tweaks here and there, but they don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with it. If the tweaks they propose encounter too much opposition, there's no need to push them through. They can make concessions because for them there are no changes that are especially urgent. Joe Biden consistently emphasizes the idea of compromise. For him, consensus is the heart of democracy, 51-52. As our economic system generates more and more resentment, it becomes increasingly difficult to make positive arguments for centrist compromises. In the 1990s, when our economic system buried communism, our system enjoyed an air of inevitability. There was enormous optimism about it. Even those who disliked the system struggled to argue for even the possibility of an alternative to it. Writing in 1989, political theorist Francis Fukuyama anticipated what was to come. The end of history will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism, will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In the post-historical period there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history. For Fukuyama, the main threat to capitalism and liberal democracy going forward was nostalgia. I can feel in myself, and see in others around me, a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. Such nostalgia, in fact, will continue to fuel competition and conflict even in the post-historical world for some time to come. This idea continues to influence centrist views about the left and the right. For the center, the left and the right are nostalgic for the 20th century, and for communism and fascism, respectively. The center believes it has the sacred duty to protect the economic and political system from these discredited, inferior alternatives, and from naive young people who take the benefits of capitalism and liberal democracy for granted. The center does not believe either the left or right can succeed in producing a competitive alternative economic system. But the center does believe that the force of nostalgia may lead the left and right to attempt to produce such a system, and that such attempts can only end in disaster. The trouble, of course, is that it is not just nostalgia that animates the left and the right. There are real problems with the American political and economic system. Fukuyama himself acknowledges some of these problems in his more recent writing, arguing that the United States has become excessively vetocratic. Too often, the American political system locks up and fails to issue decisions. This gridlock allows problems to fester. For Fukuyama, the system would run better if it were reformed to make it easier for the federal government to take decisions. He writes, many of these problems could be solved if the United States moved to a more unified parliamentary system of government, but so radical a change in the country's institutional structure is inconceivable. Americans regard their constitution as a quasi-religious document, so getting them to rethink its most basic tenets would be an uphill struggle. I think that any realistic reform program would try to trim veto points or insert parliamentary-style mechanisms to promote stronger hierarchical authority within the existing system of separated powers. The noticeable difference between Fukuyama's proposal and the more radical proposals of the left and right is that for Fukuyama, the American system still works well enough that it does not need to be urgently overhauled. From the very start, Fukuyama is willing to compromise, to accept a realistic proposal that merely tries to trim veto points or increase hierarchical authority within the existing system. The center believes that even where our system is dysfunctional, it clearly outclasses the alternatives. There is no sense of urgency. Because the center thinks the system is fundamentally sound, it doesn't take objections seriously. When people object to the economic system, the center assumes this is because they are nostalgic for the 20th century, they have authoritarian personalities, they are under the influence of Russian propaganda, they have been watching too much Fox News, or they have been sucked into online thought bubbles, 55-57. Political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt offer an especially characteristic centrist response. They argued that Donald Trump became president principally because the political parties failed in their role as gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are meant to isolate and defeat extremist forces by keeping authoritarians off the ballot, even when these people might help the party win more votes. For Levitsky and Ziblatt, Trump won because the Republican Party failed to gatekeep, and it failed to gatekeep because cable news and social media allowed Trump to build a following and raise money without having to go through traditional party channels. On this view, Trump supporters have no legitimate grievances, and the failures of our economic system play little role in his success. Trump became popular principally because the political establishment doesn't have enough control over American media, and especially over the internet. The government cannot regulate speech on the internet directly because of the First Amendment. But the government can pressure social media companies to self-regulate by threatening to target them with antitrust legislation. Between April 2018 and March 2021, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg was compelled to testify before Congress 7 times. Former Twitter head Jack Dorsey made 5 appearances, and Google's Sundar Pichai made 4. When these men testify, they get an enormous amount of negative press from traditional media outlets. The testimony has yet to result in much government regulation, but members of Congress love making threats. In 2018, Senator Lindsey Graham, RSC, directly asked Mark Zuckerberg, "You don't think you have a monopoly?" In 2020, the House Antitrust Subcommittee issued a report blatantly accusing the tech companies of operating monopolies. The constant negative press is unsettling for the tech companies, and the constant congressional hearings personally inconvenience their CEOs. There is enormous political pressure on these companies to suppress content that the center finds threatening, and to revise algorithms to favor corporate media outlets over independent creators. Donald Trump was kicked off Facebook and Twitter. Google modified its algorithm to push independent media outlets down results pages, 63, 64. All of these companies donated heavily to the Democratic Party in 2020. Interestingly, Amazon has received less attention. Jeff Bezos wasn't called to testify before Congress until July 2020. If Congress were mainly interested in breaking up monopolies, you'd think Amazon would be at the top of the list. It's the second largest company in the world by revenue, behind only Walmart. But Amazon isn't a social media company. It doesn't run a search engine. Instead, Bezos owns the Washington Post. Since Bezos bought the paper in 2013, the Washington Post has been fiercely supportive of the political establishment, firmly opposing Donald Trump, 68, 69. By buying a traditional newspaper, Bezos shored up gatekeeping institutions. Surely, it's a coincidence that Congress is much less inclined to pester him. The center isn't just trying to shore up gatekeeping by pestering tech CEOs. Centrists also take advantage of the fact that the critics of the economic system are divided into a left and a right, into both progressive and conservative camps. By framing the progressive left as nostalgic for communism and the conservative right as nostalgic for fascism, the center can motivate the left to help gatekeep the right and the right to help gatekeep the left. Berniecrats in Congress feel compelled to stop the fascism of the right, and Trump supporters feel compelled to stop the communism of the left. Each prefers the status quo over the victory of the other. The center's narrative depends on it really seeming to be the case that the left and the right are stuck in the 20th century, attempting to create new versions of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. But the Berniecrats self-identify as democratic socialists. A majority of Trump supporters feel that democracy is under attack. Each side finds it ridiculous when it is accused by the other of being a 20th century authoritarian movement. The idea of democracy is baked into both movements' critiques. Today's left-wing authors are largely proponents of neo-republicanism, deliberative democracy, and workplace democracy, 72 to 74. Today's right-wing authors are largely proponents of civic nationalism or constitutionalism, 75, 76. There are all sorts of legitimate criticisms of these positions, but they are clearly different from authoritarian communism and fascism. Nevertheless, the center remains able to play the two sides off against each other, using cultural wedge issues to keep each occupied with the threat of the other. In point of fact, the most prominent American arguments against democracy come from free trade advocates, like Jason Brennan and Brian Kaplan, who view democracy as an obstacle to the further growth of capital mobility, 77, 78. In practice, neither the left nor the right is getting anywhere, much less anywhere authoritarian. The left cannot win enough elections in a diverse enough array of districts to threaten to win power. The right won the presidency, but failed completely to meaningfully revise the global trade system. The result of half a decade's effort by both sides is Joe Biden and his Build Back Better program. The inadequacies of Joe Biden. When Joe Biden won, his supporters argued that the American political establishment was aware that drastic action needed to be taken to shore up the legitimacy of the American political system. As the historian Gary Gersel put it, the new president, grasping the magnitude of the moment and understanding that this is likely to be his last tour of public duty, has decided to channel the spirit of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's most successful Democratic president. Roosevelt himself broke with free market dogmas, insisting that the federal government had to manage capitalism in the public interest. He undertook major projects of infrastructural improvement, understanding their importance both for economic growth and for demonstrating in visually dramatic ways the Democratic Party's ability to transform for the better the everyday world in which Americans lived and worked. He opened his Democratic Party to the left, believing that such an alliance would enhance, rather than imperil, the chances of reform. He understood the need to reinvigorate democracy in the U.S. at a time when it was on the defensive in most of the rest of the world. Biden hopes to make each of these Rooseveltian projects his own. Already, it is clear that these fawning interpretations have no basis in reality. The Biden administration is doing little to fundamentally restructure the economic system. It has proposed a global minimum corporation tax rate of 15%, but this rate is substantially below the United States' own current rate of 21% and the global average of 23.5%. It's also full of loopholes. Charity organization Oxfam sees this proposal for what it is. It calls it a shameful and dangerous capitulation, and an excuse to cut domestic corporate tax rates, risking a new race to the bottom. With no real stomach for reining in tax avoidance, the Biden administration is unable to credibly fund its spending proposals. The American Society of Civil Engineers believes the United States needs to spend an additional $2.59 trillion on traditional infrastructure over the next 10 years, just to keep existing infrastructure in good repair. But Biden's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act only spends $1.2 trillion, of which only $579 billion is new spending. Even that bill is expected to add $256 billion to the federal deficit. Biden pledged to make up for the bipartisan bill's shortcomings with a second, human infrastructure, bill. But that bill was slowly ground down into a fine paste. The spending that made it into the Inflation Reduction Act is largely unrelated to the problems highlighted by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Even before the concessions, the Build Back Better bill was never about changing the global economic system. Instead, it was firmly focused on helping Americans adapt. In a speech defending the original human infrastructure bill in West Lafayette, Indiana, Bernie Sanders revealed not only that the economic system will not be reined in, but that its competitive incentives make it unrealistic for parents to raise their own children. He argued that in a highly competitive global economy, it was no longer possible for working families to keep a parent at home. To address this problem, the human infrastructure bill pledged to spend $400 billion to subsidize childcare. Parents would have to meet a work requirement to qualify. When this is the sort of argument even the president's left-wing supporters are making, you can be sure that, as Biden himself put it, nothing will fundamentally change. Of course, even this milquetoast proposal failed to make it into the Inflation Reduction Act. As I've shown in this chapter, none of the three movements, the left, the right, or the center, poses any serious threat to the power of oligarchs and corporations. None of the three has any hope of bringing relief to Americans. Each of the three nonetheless encourages Americans to engage in the democratic political system. Each movement does everything it can to get Americans to hope that it might be successful and to encourage Americans to fear that its adversaries might win instead. Each movement draws on a small army of politicians, commentators, journalists, and media personalities. By manufacturing hope and fear, these political professionals create the illusion that contemporary American politics has real stakes. They have no choice. The three movements know that if they did what was really necessary to challenge the economic system, they'd face political oblivion. When they win, as the right did in 2016 and the center did in 2020, they quickly back away from any measures that would seriously disrupt supply chains. Trump enacted performative tariffs that posed no real threat. Biden has signed onto a performative minimum rate of corporation tax that poses no real threat. When these movements lose, they don't engage in any introspection about their political strategy. Changing strategy might be good politics, but it's bad business. Viable political movements find a way to talk to the whole country, but successful media outlets cultivate a fiercely loyal, niche audience by pandering to resentment and libidinal desire. Miserable economic conditions force a marriage between politics and entertainment, turning all political movements into media industries. Unable to solve the unsolvable problem, and unable even to admit when their electoral strategies are minoritarian, the three movements nonetheless must continue to find ways to get people to participate in the political system. When they lose elections, they blame defeat on American democratic procedures. They propose reforms to make it easier for them to win. The left calls for campaign finance reform. It tries to make it easier for people to vote. It entertains fantasies of abolishing the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the Electoral College. The right tries to make it harder for people to commit voter fraud and files endless electoral lawsuits hoping to uncover corruption. The center tries to restore the power of gatekeepers, to strengthen the position of the political establishment within the party system. The result is an intense contest over the meaning of democracy. Each side fancies itself as democracy's savior. Each side demonizes its opponents as authoritarian. All of them will tell you that the future of democracy is at stake. If you will not vote out of hope, you will vote out of fear. 1. Copyright the authors, under exclusive license to Springer Nature Switzerland AG 2023. B. Studebaker, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy https://doi.org/10.1007/978-3-031-28210-2_33. Chronic Crisis. Benjamin Studebaker 1. Department of Politics and International Studies, Polis, University of Cambridge, Cambridge, UK. Keywords: legitimacy, crisis, resentment, tyranny, totalitarianism. As the three political movements find themselves unable to meaningfully improve voters' lives, they lean ever more heavily on the argument that their rivals pose an existential threat to democracy. The harder it is to make the case for hope, the more they rely on fear. At several points in this book, I've picked at these fear narratives. Now, in this chapter, it is time to confront them head-on. I'll argue that our political leaders and commentators are fundamentally mischaracterizing our crisis. It is not an existential struggle for the survival of democracy. It's a chronic struggle over democracy's meaning. Two types of fearmongering, one theory of crisis. Let's start by reviewing some of the arguments people use to spread fear about the future of democracy. The people who think American democracy is in existential danger make their argument in two ways. Some make procedural arguments, alleging that the United States has drifted away from democratic norms, 1 to 3. Procedural arguments mostly come from the center. Others make cultural arguments, suggesting that American democracy is being taken over by some enemy group, 4 to 10. These cultural arguments mostly come from the left and the right. Procedural accounts try to draw lessons from history. They compare the United States to countries like Hungary, Venezuela, Turkey, or Germany in the 1930s. They try to identify the warning signs in these countries' political systems, and then look for similar signs in American politics. 4. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. The warning signs include a weak commitment to the Constitution, denying the legitimacy of political opponents, the toleration of violence, and a readiness to curtail civil liberties. In other countries, leaders have done these things, and then proceeded to dismantle democratic procedures. It is easy to argue that Donald Trump did some of these things. He suggested his life would be easier if he were an autocrat. He said Hillary Clinton should be in jail. He challenged the results of the 2020 election. He often refuses to condemn extreme supporters, and he is openly contemptuous of the press. At its worst, the lessons from history argument can become pretty simple. 1. In country X, leader Y did thing Z, and then leader Y destroyed democracy. 2. In the United States, Donald Trump did thing Z. 3. Donald Trump poses an existential threat to democracy. When it takes this form, the argument brushes up against a kind of association fallacy. By associating certain behaviors with autocrats and then associating those same behaviors with Donald Trump, the lessons from history genre suggests that Trump is like Hugo Chavez, Viktor Orban, or Recep Erdogan. In some sense, he might be like them. He may have a similar personality. He may even have a similar attitude to democracy. But it does not follow from there that he poses the same threat to American democracy that those leaders posed to democracy in Venezuela, Hungary, or Turkey. The destruction of democracy doesn't just require a leader with authoritarian impulses. To destroy democracy, the would-be authoritarian needs support from the public and from the other parts of the state. When Donald Trump tried to challenge the result of the 2020 election, he got very little support. The same Supreme Court justices he appointed helped dismiss his legal challenges. His own vice president refused to cooperate. The national security community was, if anything, more interested in deposing Trump than in supporting him in a power grab. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, put it, "They may try, but they're not going to fucking succeed. You can't do this without the military. You can't do this without the CIA and the FBI. We're the guys with the guns." The stronger procedural accounts acknowledge that Trump's authoritarian tendencies are not in themselves enough to destroy democracy. Instead, they argue that Trump's behavior erodes democratic norms, increasing the willingness of American voters and institutions to support authoritarianism going forward. In a piece Levitsky and Ziblatt recently wrote for The Atlantic, they argue that the bulk of the Republican Party is now behaving in an anti-democratic manner. They suggest that in the future the Republicans will go further than they did in 2020, and actually support an attempt to overturn an election result. Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that American democracy must be saved by democratizing it. They advocate a suite of electoral and constitutional reforms that make it harder for the Republican Party to win elections. The same authors who suggested that a weak commitment to the Constitution is a sign of authoritarianism argue that the best way to defend the Constitution is to change it. Their attempts to purify democracy look authoritarian to Republicans, and many Republican state legislatures have responded with electoral reforms that preserve the Republican Party's political competitiveness. Those voter fraud laws, in turn, look like an authoritarian form of voter suppression to Democrats. The result is an intense fight over voter access laws that diminishes the confidence of both parties' supporters in the electoral system. The less confidence voters have, the more they'll want to overturn electoral results or push for electoral reforms that will further undermine the credibility of the process for the other side. The things we do to defend democratic norms often contribute to their further erosion. Attempts to shore up democracy highlight the fact that we've ceased to agree on what it means. Cultural accounts argue that there is no unifying American identity to keep the country together. Instead, American democracy has been captured, or is in the process of being captured, by some nefarious subgroup. Progressive accounts emphasize the control of white supremacists and fascists, 4-6. Carol Anderson, a professor of African American studies, argues that white rage has undermined democracy and warped the Constitution. Joe Feagin, a sociologist, goes further, arguing that the American Constitution has always been racist, and that a new constitutional convention is needed to free it from racism's grip. The philosopher Jason Stanley combines elements of these positions. Like Feagin, he argues that fascism's roots have been present in the United States for more than a century. But, like Anderson, he argues that fascism is ascendant today. Stanley explicitly accuses Donald Trump of fascist political tactics, and associates Trump's white supporters with fascist lines of thinking. As we discussed in Chapter 2, conservative accounts emphasize tribal identity groups, unassimilable immigrants, a decadent elite, and cultural Marxists, 7-10. It should not surprise us that each of these sides regards the other as a threat to democracy, and each accuses the other of using democratic language as a cover for sinister goals. Both the procedural and cultural accounts share certain core features. They both describe a period in which democratic norms are eroded or in which a nefarious group gains power and influence. During this period, American democracy is in danger, but it has not yet been annihilated. There remains some chance that democracy might be saved. If, however, the warning signs are ignored, then the norms continue to be eroded or the nefarious group continues to gain power, until eventually there is a moment of reckoning. This is the moment when American democracy is truly destroyed. German historian Reinhard Koselleck argued that political legitimacy crises have two phases. In the latent phase, the state and society become morally alienated from one another. The state neglects the values of its citizens. In response, the citizens increasingly abandon the state's values. Eventually, the gap between citizens' values and the values of the state becomes too large for the citizens to continue to accept the state's political order. In the acute phase, the citizens reject the order, and there is a revolt or revolution of some kind. Both the procedural and cultural accounts make arguments that fit within Koselleck's frame. The American state is associated with a set of democratic values. But then, Americans drift away from that value set, either through the erosion of norms or through the nefarious influence of radical groups. For these writers, we may still be in the latent phase, but the acute phase is coming, and when it arrives, American democracy will face existential danger. While we are still in the latent phase, we need to do something to prevent escalation to the acute phase. Many of these contemporary writers argue that we have to do something to restore norms or to weaken the nefarious groups. Koselleck argued that the state cannot afford to ignore the values of its citizens. When citizens are drifting away from democratic values, the state needs to intervene in the culture to stop this drift. If it is not proactive in the latent phase, it will be forced to act in the acute phase. In that phase, democracy's very survival is called into question. Therefore, it is dangerous and irresponsible for political leaders to wait for the acute phase. They must act in the latent phase, while there is still time. Problems with Koselleck's theory. Koselleck's theory treats political crises mainly as questions of values. On his view, the fact that citizens have different values from the state itself suggests that an acute crisis is coming. The more separation between the values of the political establishment and the values of wider society, the more cause there is for concern. Even if the value disagreement does not begin as disagreement about democracy, the fact that democracy is unable to give voters what they value means that voters will lose their commitment to the democratic political system over time. On this view, if voters want the unsolvable problem resolved, the fact that the state cannot solve it will gradually push voters to reject the democratic political system. The American political elite is committed to the global economic order, either because they believe in it or because they see no alternative to it that is consistent with getting re-elected. The voters are frustrated. They resent the economic system, or, at the very least, they resent its consequences and the various social and cultural groups they blame for those consequences. Sooner or later, on this theory, that resentment will metastasize and spread to the democratic system itself. The theory sounds persuasive if you stay on its terrain. When I wrote my master's thesis in 2014, it was more or less what I believed. But I eventually moved away from this position for 4 key reasons. The United States has an advanced economic toolkit that enables it to buy time. As Wolfgang Streeck argues, it is possible to use a mixture of public and private debt, quantitative easing, and stimulus spending to cushion the blow of economic shocks. By quickly injecting cash into the economy, these measures prevent Americans from becoming so miserable that they have nothing to lose. After the coronavirus, the United States endured a deep recession, but it was able to avoid instability with a relatively modest package of stimulus checks and loans to businesses. It did not have to make any deep structural reforms to the economic system, and its political system made short work of Donald Trump's attempt to challenge the results of the election. Other countries often struggle to implement emergency economic measures, but bondholders give the American federal government a lot of room to get itself out of tough spots. Interest rates on U.S. Treasuries continue to be very low, often even lower than the inflation rate. It's difficult for an economic crisis to produce a political crisis in a country with such easy access to credit. Bondholders don't want the global economic system to fail, and they will back the federal government as long as they believe the federal government is acting to defend the system. Despite everything that American citizens have had to endure over the past few decades, American politics is still heavily shaped by the idea that the United States is a democratic country, and that democracy is principally responsible for its success and longevity. While many contemporary political theorists like to challenge America's democratic credentials, the United States has been justifying itself to its citizens by appeal to democratic concepts since at least the time of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, 17-19. Contemporary commentators often deny that the early United States was a proper democracy because of slavery and voting restrictions. They have a point, but this has little to do with the way the United States has pitched itself, ideologically. The United States tells its citizens that it is a democracy or a democratic republic, and most Americans at most points in American history have believed some version of this. Even prominent, highly educated Americans frame the United States as a democratic country, and many of them explicitly attributed the United States' ability to overcome Nazi Germany and outlast the Soviet Union to the advantages of the democratic political system, 20-23. While there is frustration today with the way the political system is performing, the Founding Fathers still enjoy enormously high favorability ratings. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson enjoy favorability ratings of 94% and 89%, respectively, 24-26. Only 26% of Americans think the founders would approve of the state of the country, while 53% think the founders would view America as a failure. When they criticize the contemporary American system, Americans imagine themselves to be on the same side as the founders. They are interested in making the founders' system work better, not in replacing it with something else. There are no alternatives to democracy that appear viable to most American citizens. On the contrary, most alternatives to democracy frighten most Americans, and the fear that democracy might be replaced by something else motivates a lot of our political action. Before the United States fought World War II and the Cold War, it was easier for Americans to entertain the possibility of adopting a fascist or communist system. Communism and fascism were still new and unproven ideas, and the United States had not yet defined itself against them. But even before World War II, communism and fascism struggled to gain traction. While the Socialist Labour Party displaced the Liberal Party in the UK, the Democratic Party saw off challenges from upstart socialist parties. Perennial third-party socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs never won more than 6% of the vote. Wealthy Nazi sympathizers with ties to veterans groups plotted against Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, but they didn't advance beyond the planning stages, 28-29. They were exposed by the very man they planned to make dictator, a retired general named Smedley Butler. Butler was known mostly for his pacifism. It's not a very useful trait in a coup leader. Once the United States began defining itself against fascism and communism, support for these alternatives began to appear un-American, and once Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union collapsed, they were largely discredited. Today, they function mainly as terms of abuse. Democrats accuse Republicans of fascism and Republicans accuse Democrats of communism precisely because these systems are so thoroughly discredited that it's a political liability to be associated with them. No other compelling alternative political systems have emerged over the past 30 years. A full 85% of Americans have a negative view of Russia, and only 6% have confidence in Vladimir Putin's ability to do the right thing. 30-31. Nearly as many Americans have a negative view of China. More than 70% of U.S. voters consistently say that it would be too risky to give U.S. presidents more power to deal directly with the country's problems. That includes 66% of Democrats under the Obama administration and 66% of Republicans under Trump. The promise of saving our democracy with procedural reforms continues to excite many Americans, even though these reforms have poor prospects. An overwhelming 85% of Americans feel the political system needs to be completely reformed, or needs major changes. Substantial numbers of people support eliminating the Electoral College, redrawing gerrymandered congressional districts, increasing voter access, dumping the Senate filibuster, and reining in the role of money in politics. 33-35. Smaller minorities support more drastic measures, like changing the way the Senate allocates seats. Every congressional session, more than 60 constitutional amendments are proposed by members of Congress. In 2014, former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens even wrote a book explicitly recommending 6 distinct amendments. None of these amendments go anywhere. The Constitution hasn't been successfully amended since 1992. Joe Biden ran on the For the People bill, which included many individually popular procedural reforms. But after narrowly squeaking through the House, the bill died in the Senate, with Democrats unwilling to circumvent the filibuster to pass it. Even on those rare occasions when bipartisan reforms have been enacted, they have not amounted to much. The McCain-Feingold Act attempted to rein in the power of wealthy donors, but its scope was heavily limited by the need to avoid running afoul of the Supreme Court. It focused on formal campaign spending, and it failed to do much about informal political spending by organizations that distance themselves from specific campaigns. Even with these accommodations, McCain-Feingold was heavily diminished by subsequent court rulings like the Citizens United decision. For the People and McCain-Feingold were not dramatic reforms. They would even not bring American democratic procedures in line with European examples, and European democracies themselves struggled to hold back the growing power of oligarchs and corporations. But even these petty political reforms cannot survive our heavily gridlocked legislative process. Nonetheless, Americans would rather get excited about doomed reforms than support alternatives to democracy. Even though most of the reforms will never pass, and even though most of the reforms are too weak to stand any chance of unlocking solutions to the unsolvable problem, Americans still prefer to continue pursuing them. That's how committed Americans are, not just to democracy, but to the U.S. Constitution. Even changing the way senators are allocated goes too far. Less than 30% of American voters support that reform. As much as our political system frustrates and infuriates our citizens, they see no viable alternative to it. This is the key fact about the American crisis, and it's the fact that the fearmongers overlook and downplay, time and time again. If, when push comes to shove, Americans will stick with a system they consider dysfunctional rather than take the risk of trying an alternative system of government, they cannot existentially threaten democracy. The crisis can never escalate to Koselleck's acute level. Does that mean that there's no crisis at all? Political theorist Andrew Gamble argues democracy can be in crisis even when its survival is never called into question. His account of crisis is very different from Koselleck's. Gamble contrasts situational crises with structural crises. Situational crises are particular moments that require an immediate response from the state. Structural crises are a condition rather than an event. In this crisis condition, the state becomes mired in long-term and persistent deadlocks. Those deadlocks lead to a large number of situational crises, but none of these crisis moments threatens the survival of democracy. On the contrary, it is the fact that these moments of crisis do not threaten democracy that allows a structural crisis to continue producing moments of crisis. In Koselleck's model, the fear is that a final, decisive acute crisis will arrive. In Gamble's model, the fear is that each moment of crisis will just lead to further moments, in an endless stream of misery. Koselleck fears the end of the crisis. Gamble fears the opposite, a crisis without end. This insight from Gamble is incredibly valuable. It allows us to think about the American crisis in a completely different way. In the next section, I'll build on Gamble's theory and develop an alternative account of the American crisis. The chronic legitimacy crisis, an alternative model. I want to suggest that the United States faces a chronic legitimacy crisis. A chronic legitimacy crisis is chronic, because all the ways of resolving the crisis quickly are straightforwardly blocked. Like Gamble's structural crises, my chronic crisis features long-term and persistent deadlocks that immiserate Americans over and over again. These deadlocks never destroy the American political system, but they also prevent it from taking any meaningful steps to resolve the crisis. The system is stuck in place. It goes on deadlocking, no matter what we try. The chronic legitimacy crisis is a crisis of legitimacy in the sense that it raises a question about whether our political system is, in philosopher Bernard Williams's words, acceptable. Acceptability is about whether the political system appears justified to each of the state's subjects. Citizens accept justifications for the system to the extent that they tolerate it, even when it does things they resent. It's easy to think of legitimacy as something a political system either has or doesn't have. You could frame this as a binary, and argue that either our citizens tolerate our political system or they don't. But I think it's more helpful to think of legitimacy in a more sophisticated way. There are at least 4 levels of legitimacy. 1. Perfect. 2. Full. 3. Minimal. 4. Liminal. Perfect legitimacy. When the political system has perfect legitimacy, citizens accept the kind of system they have, the specific decision-making procedures that make up that system, and the specific decisions those procedures yield. If the United States had perfect legitimacy, Americans would not only accept democracy, but they would also believe that its specific procedures are swell. They'd accept what political theorist John Rawls calls the constitutional essentials, or basic structure, of the system. That includes things like the branches of government, the electoral system, the relationship between the federal government and the states, and so on. They would also accept every decision those procedures yield. No political system is perfect, and no political system ever achieves perfect legitimacy. That's probably a good thing. Perfect legitimacy is kind of creepy. A system with perfect legitimacy does not need to do anything to satisfy its citizens. It does not have to adapt or evolve. Its citizens fully embrace the justifications it offers them. Full legitimacy. When the system has full legitimacy, citizens accept the kind of political system they have and they accept the constitutional essentials and basic structure, but they are frequently unhappy with the specific decisions the government makes. Sometimes they don't like particular elected officials or they disagree with specific laws or court decisions. They do, however, feel that the political system operates fairly. They might not like the results of a given election, but they don't want to change the way elections work. They might not like some of the laws, but they don't want to change the legislative process. When their side loses, they accept defeat without trying to change the rules. Defeat is okay, because they believe in the system, and they believe that they stand a fair chance of winning next time. They may be critical of the government, but they're fiercely loyal to the political process. They have a kind of political sportsmanship. They're good losers. Unlike perfect legitimacy, full legitimacy is compatible with a level of diversity, of pluralism. John Rawls often expressed a desire for an overlapping consensus on the basic structure. He hoped different people with different values could agree on the same constitution for different reasons. This thin agreement on the political procedures allows for a lot of disagreement about values and policy. Rawls associates this condition with what he calls the liberal principle of legitimacy. His principle requires that power is only exercised in accordance with a constitution, written or unwritten, the essentials of which all citizens, as reasonable and rational, can endorse in the light of their common human reason. Minimal legitimacy. Unfortunately for Rawls, full legitimacy is itself extremely difficult to obtain. Most of the time, some of the people who lose political debates find defeat unacceptable. They set about trying to reform political procedures to make them fairer, and their notion of fairness often has a lot to do with whatever enables them to win. It would be easy to assume that these people pose an existential threat to democracy. In their book, Acemoglu and Robinson paint political sore losers as the principal threat to what they call inclusive institutions. But many of these citizens remain committed to the democratic system. The reforms they demand are relatively innocuous, like electoral and campaign finance reform. While many of the winners might oppose the sore losers' reforms, it is not straightforwardly the case that the losers' reforms would destroy democracy. Indeed, the losers make democratic arguments for their reforms, arguing that these reforms would eliminate corruption, weaken entrenched elites, and make the system more democratic and inclusive than it was before. When there's agreement that the political system should be a democracy, but not on the constitutional essentials and basic structure, the political system has minimal legitimacy. Under minimal legitimacy, people still care deeply about democracy, but they feel the political system is failing to live up to democratic promises. They want real democracy, freed from corruption and dysfunction. They feel the procedures need to be substantially reformed, and that the existing form of democracy just isn't good enough. For them, the existing procedures have failed to express the idea of democracy. They remain loyal to the democratic idea, but not to the specific political structures that have been adopted in its name. Minimal legitimacy is even more pluralist than full legitimacy. The reformers all agree that the existing structure is inadequate, that democracy needs to be purified. But they often have completely different ideas about how democracy should be restructured. They might want to substantially change the electoral system, the legislative process, or the distribution of power among the branches of government. They might want to increase the power of the federal government at the expense of the states, or vice versa. Ask 6 different reformers how we should go about trying to save democracy, and they may give you 6 different answers. Minimal legitimacy therefore contains much more conflict and division than full legitimacy. Sometimes reform proposals are so different from one another that the would-be reformers come to despise each other at least as much as they despise the defenders of the dysfunctional system. This results not in straightforward, binary polarization, but in multipolar politics. Multiple factions of reformers spring up, attacking both the status quo and each other. As the status quo weakens, its dwindling defenders are forced to exploit divisions among the reformers, pitting different reform movements against each other in an increasingly desperate bid to limit the amount of reform. Liminal legitimacy. In cases where there isn't even agreement on the regime type, we have only liminal legitimacy. Under liminal legitimacy, people abandon even the idea of democracy, actively promoting authoritarian political systems and valuing them for their own sake. This is the point where there's a real existential threat to democracy, where there's an imminent threat of an acute crisis. Under liminal legitimacy, people feel that even the idea of democracy has failed. They have stopped caring about democratic values. They just want to win, and they're willing to embrace any system of government that allows them to win. But things don't get this far in the United States. Because the United States has an advanced economic toolkit, a deeply entrenched democratic ideology, a lack of compelling alternatives, and a persistent attachment to the idea of reform, American political legitimacy does not drop below the minimal level. No matter how frustrated we become with our democracy, the vast majority of us remain committed to democracy as a political system or as an ideal. Chronic crises occur when we get stuck in minimal legitimacy. Most of the time, in practice, the American political system enjoys a level of legitimacy somewhere between full and minimal. The closer we come to full legitimacy, the more we feel there is a sense of consensus, that some kind of normal situation has been established. Think of the post-war consensus in the late 1950s and early 60s, or morning in America, in the mid-80s. During these periods, there's a lot of bipartisan behavior, because political differences are smaller and less fundamental. The closer we come to minimal legitimacy, the more we feel the political system is in crisis. Think of the crisis of confidence in the late 1970s and early 80s, or the intense polarization that increasingly marks the 21st century, especially after the global economic crisis of 2008. We feel the system is in crisis in part because it's very easy to confuse minimal legitimacy with liminal legitimacy. When we have minimal legitimacy, there's disagreement about what democracy means. Each faction wants to save democracy with a set of purifying reforms, but each faction thinks that the other faction's reforms are a threat to democracy. Each faction frames its rivals as authoritarian. Each faction is constantly fearmongering about threats to democracy. Before too long, nearly everyone agrees that democracy is in danger, even though nearly everyone wants to defend democracy. Even if there's no chance that legitimacy will become liminal, a prolonged period in which the political system is stuck in minimal legitimacy causes trouble. For Williams, legitimacy crises are driven by resentment. The more resentment people feel, the less legitimacy there is. Resentment is in turn driven by lack of identification with the actions of the state. When the political system doesn't solve the unsolvable problem, but instead defends the interests of oligarchs and corporations, citizens increasingly feel unable to identify with political decisions. They start to suppose that the state is ignoring their interests because its procedures are dysfunctional or have been captured by some enemy group. Increasingly, their political action is motivated by a desire to fix the procedures, to drive out the enemy, and, often, to fix the procedures in a way that drives out the enemy. Political debates become increasingly meta. We are constantly discussing the procedures and enemy groups. We stop using the procedures to issue decisions, because we have no confidence that the procedures are capable of issuing good decisions. We fall into long-term and persistent deadlocks. Pressing problems are ignored. The economic sources of resentment are never properly addressed. Politicians induce voters to identify with them by adopting the vote as enemies as their own, because it's easier to mirror voters' emotions than it is to break the deadlock and deliver meaningful economic change. In our chronic crisis, the political system cannot deliver more than minimal legitimacy for an extended period of time. A functional political system pushes toward full legitimacy by proactively dealing with sources of resentment. But our political system is unable to deal with the source of our resentment, and as the resentment builds, it takes over our entire political culture. No one agrees on what democracy concretely means, procedurally. Everyone thinks their reforms support democracy, but everyone thinks everyone else's reforms are an attempt to rig it. Attempts to purify democracy are confused with attempts to destroy it. The harder people try to save democracy, the more they appear to be its enemies. We end up in an endless conversation about political reform and cultural struggle. Amidst this cacophony of resentment and rage, the true sources of resentment struggle even to get on the political agenda in the first place. Unable to proactively deal with the economic sources of resentment, the United States cannot push for full legitimacy. Unable to reject democracy in favor of some other system, it cannot fall into liminal legitimacy. It is trapped in minimal legitimacy indefinitely, and for that reason, it's in a chronic crisis. Now, you might have a friend who thinks it's obvious that the political reforms they prefer are compatible with democracy. They cannot understand how anyone honestly believes that their political reforms are authoritarian. They are sure people who accuse them of authoritarianism are acting in bad faith. Perhaps your friend thinks those people are acting in bad faith because they're the real authoritarians. There are some theorists who have argued that certain kinds of political reforms are straightforwardly authoritarian. Nancy Bermeo argues that democratic backsliding is frequently done in the name of making the political system more democratic. She argues that some reforms amount to executive aggrandizement or strategic election manipulation. Theorists writing in her vein often argue that we can tell the difference between benign and harmful democratic reforms. If that were so, the chronic crisis would be easier to navigate. We could simply support the good, democratic reforms and oppose the bad, quasi-authoritarian reforms. I don't think it's that simple. I want to say a little more about why it's so easy to confuse attempts to save democracy with attempts to kill it. Why purification reforms are confused with authoritarianism. To understand why it is so difficult to draw a clear line between purifying reforms and authoritarianism, it's important to understand that people support democracy for different reasons, and their reasons sometimes conflict with each other. In their discussion of the advantages of democracy, North, Wallace, and Weingast emphasize two distinct features. Democracies are dynamic. They are adaptable. When a democratically elected government performs poorly, it can be voted out. New governments can change policy. This allows democracies to try many different policies in response to problems. Authoritarian states often get stuck with policies that don't work. They cannot easily U-turn on their policies without looking incompetent. They have no formal procedural mechanism for changing leadership when it's clear that change is needed. Because they have such a hard time changing governments and changing policies, they often respond to resentment by trying to repress it. They crack down on dissent, and this makes their citizens fear the consequences of complaining. When citizens stay silent, authoritarian states don't see problems coming until they're very serious. Once a problem arises, they may only get one shot at solving it. If their first solution fails, they struggle to change strategy, and the consequences of sticking with a bad strategy can pile up quickly. Democracies are credible. They are predictable. Democracies have impersonal decision-making institutions. These institutions observe the rule of law. They reliably perform in a consistent way. Authoritarian states often rely heavily on particular individuals. Those individual leaders can be capricious and arbitrary in their decisions. Even when the leaders are consistent, the system depends too much on individual leaders to maintain that consistency. If a leader dies or leaves office, there is no guarantee that the next leader will honor the commitments of their predecessor. Democracy's mechanistic procedures, their complex systems of checks and balances, diminish the power and influence of particular individuals and produce more predictable results over time. The trouble is that these two advantages do not obviously go together neatly. Credibility is associated with predictability, and dynamism is associated with change. The more dynamic a democracy is, the less credible it is, and the more credible a democracy is, the less dynamic it is. If you vote in a new government and it makes sweeping changes, the credibility of the system is threatened. If elections don't meaningfully change policy, then they don't offer much in the way of dynamism. When the left, the right, and the center look at our democratic system, they see different problems with it. Sometimes, they're worried that our system isn't dynamic enough. Elections come and go, but neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are able to win enough seats in Congress to make many of the changes that the left and the right feel we need. They're frustrated because their hopes keep getting disappointed. Even the center sometimes gets frustrated with gridlock when it struggles to raise the debt ceiling or pass basic budget bills. Other times, they're worried that our system isn't credible enough. The left and the center worry that if the right wins, it will do creepy fascist things. The center and the right worry that if the left wins, it will do creepy communist things. They fear that the hopes of their enemies may prove justified, and they fear they cannot rely on our system of checks and balances to keep the system credible and protect the status quo. Procedural reforms can shore up dynamism, but only at the expense of credibility, and they can shore up credibility, but only at the expense of dynamism. If your purification reforms are designed to increase dynamism, but your opponents think the problem is that democracy isn't credible enough, your opponents will view your reform as counterproductive and potentially authoritarian. By the same token, if your reforms are designed to shore up credibility, somebody else will think your reforms are an attack on dynamism. Real democratic procedures combine dynamism and credibility by sitting somewhere in between the two. It is not at all obvious which one should be prioritized. Some situations call for dynamism and some call for credibility. No set of democratic procedures can perfectly produce each of these virtues whenever they're needed. It gets worse. There are two types of dynamism. When we make it easier to change the government, we don't necessarily make it easier to change policy. If it's very easy to vote out the government becomes skittish about taking policy risks. In our system, where the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years, members of the House worry a lot about the electoral consequences of their voting decisions. In some European systems, where there may be 5 years between general elections, legislators are much more secure. They can take bigger policy risks, especially early in their terms, because they know it will be a while before they can be replaced. But at the same time, if we respond by allowing politicians to avoid elections for ages, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll make the changes we want to see. Insulation from electoral pressure allows politicians to ignore popular demands, or to make unpopular legislation that favors preferred interest groups. Electoral dynamism and policy dynamism don't guarantee one another. We can have electoral dynamism without policy dynamism without electoral dynamism, or neither one, but it's quite hard to consistently have both. The power of oligarchs and corporations is never seriously challenged, in part because politicians do not think they can win re-election during periods when global supply chains are disrupted. If they had longer terms, they might feel more secure, and they might be more willing to take risks. But at the same time, if they had longer terms, they could more easily ignore public resentment and go on perpetuating the status quo. We cannot be sure that increasing or decreasing electoral dynamism would produce policy dynamism. So, which would help more? Should we increase electoral dynamism and make politicians more accountable to voters, or should we increase policy dynamism and give politicians more room to try bigger, riskier policy reforms? The answer is not at all obvious. If you think accountability is the problem, you'll despise efforts to give politicians more room to maneuver. If you think the politicians need to be encouraged to take political risks, you'll despise efforts to make them more accountable. Then there's the question of what we mean by authoritarianism. When many people worry about authoritarianism, they're worried about tyranny, about some particular person or branch of government gaining so much discretionary power that they become impossible to stop. But it's also possible to have authoritarian systems where no particular person or group of people have much power. In these systems, impersonal incentives supervene upon individuals and groups, compelling them to obey structural imperatives. Impersonal authoritarianism isn't tyranny because it doesn't require a tyrant. It is totalitarian rather than tyrannical. Power rests not with particular people but with a bureaucracy with its own internal logic. In totalitarian systems, the people who appear to be in charge can only occupy important offices insofar as their behavior conforms to the logic of the system they're participating in. They look powerful, but their power is an illusion, because if they try to use it to change the fundamental character of the system they're in, they lose that power. Consider a corporate CEO, for instance. The power of the CEO of a public corporation is heavily limited by the fact that the CEO's power depends entirely on the CEO's ability to generate profit for shareholders. If the CEO tries to be a nice guy or faffs about, the CEO will cease to be a CEO. In this way, CEOs are not tyrants. They are beholden to the incentive structure that governs public corporations. Public corporations are totalitarian rather than tyrannical. They are dominated by impersonal bureaucracies rather than lone tyrants. If you are worried about tyranny, you respond to tyranny by decreasing the power of particular individuals and groups. You do this by creating sets of impersonal rules that circumscribe their behavior. This transfers power from particular people to impersonal systems. You combat the threat of tyranny by making the system stronger than the people who participate in it. Conversely, if you are worried about totalitarianism, you respond to it by increasing the power of individuals and groups to change structural incentives. This means giving them more autonomy from impersonal systems, and that means giving them powers that the system is unable to check. You combat the threat of totalitarianism by weakening the system and strengthening the people who participate in it. This means that in the name of defeating tyranny, we enact reforms that look totalitarian to other people. In the name of defeating totalitarianism, we enact reforms that look tyrannical to other people. If you worry about the possibility that Donald Trump might become a tyrant, you might want to regulate the internet in such a way that Donald Trump's message cannot get out. In doing this, you increase the power of an impersonal regulatory system to check the power of a particular individual. But if you aren't worried that Donald Trump might become a tyrant, you might instead be very concerned about a totalitarian takeover of the internet by the state or by transnational corporations like Facebook. The more you try to stop tyranny, the more you appear to be totalitarian, and the more you try to stop totalitarianism, the more you appear to favor tyranny. In both cases, you look authoritarian even though you are trying to fight authoritarianism. When we come closer to achieving full legitimacy, these problems are avoided. When we agree not just on democracy as a system, but on a particular set of democratic procedures, we don't negotiate these questions about whether our procedures should be dynamic or credible, or whether we have enough electoral or policy dynamism. We don't worry about whether our system looks too close to tyranny or totalitarianism. As the historian Christopher Mextreth argues, when we have a shared history of understanding democracy in a particular way, through a particular procedural schema, this shared history allows us to bracket these procedural questions and focus on substantive issues. But as we move closer to minimal legitimacy, this historical consensus breaks down. When our shared understanding of democracy breaks down, we discover that we like democracy for very different reasons. The reforms we propose take democracy in very different directions, playing up some advantages at the expense of others. In a chronic crisis, when we change our procedures, we further erode this inherited consensus. It happens even when we change our procedures in an attempt to defend the system. The Democrats reformed the voting system to enable voters to vote by mail during the pandemic. For them, this was a common-sense measure to allow voters who feared coronavirus to vote from home. It was about maintaining voter access. But it took a long time to count those mail-in ballots. The delay in the count undermined the credibility of the voting process. The fact that the voting system had been so recently changed encouraged people to cast doubt on the result. In a bid to keep voter participation up and preserve their odds of defeating Donald Trump at the ballot box, the Democrats did lasting damage to the consensus that American elections are conducted in a fair way. To increase electoral dynamism, they damaged the credibility of the voting system. Now many Republicans want to repeal these changes, but if they repeal them, the Democrats accuse them of suppressing the vote. It is now impossible to find a new consensus that satisfies both sides. They both support democracy. They both want free and fair elections. But they no longer share an understanding of what that means. Once you break a procedural consensus, it is difficult to rebuild it. If the Electoral College were eliminated, this consensus would break down even further. The more the Democrats try to use procedural reforms to stop the authoritarian Republicans, the more the Democrats and Republicans will disagree about the electoral laws. This will make the Republicans appear even more authoritarian to the Democrats, and that will make them try even harder to beat the Republicans with procedural reforms, and the harder they try to beat the Republicans with procedural reforms, the more authoritarian they will appear to the Republicans. A nasty spiral ensues, in which everyone looks more and more authoritarian to everyone else, even though everybody remains firmly committed to democracy. Nancy Bermio's catalog of different forms of democratic backsliding doesn't do much to help us here. A right-wing reform that strengthens the executive might look like tyrannical executive aggrandizement to liberals. But to the right, the same reform might look like a benign way of increasing policy dynamism and combating totalitarianism. Reforms that increase voter access might look like strategic election manipulation to conservative Republicans. But to liberal Democrats, the same reforms are simply a means of ensuring that Republican state legislatures do not use voter fraud laws to strategically manipulate elections in favor of the potentially tyrannical Donald Trump. Political theorists can try to insist on definitions of executive aggrandizement or strategic election manipulation that draw clear lines, but they will draw those lines in a politically motivated way, based on their own views about dynamism and credibility or tyranny and totalitarianism. There is no way to authoritatively say what reforms count as democratic and what reforms don't without resorting to authoritarianism. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other reasons people like democracy. Some political theorists like democracy because they think it embodies some principle of fairness. Some theorists like democracy because they think it draws on the diffuse knowledge of the whole population. Some theorists like democracy because they think it empowers peoples, enabling their will to be discovered and implemented. Other democratic theorists object to the very idea of the nation. All of these theorists support democracy. The fact that they disagree so heavily about why we should support democracy, and on what democracy concretely requires, underlines the reality that we are in a prolonged period of minimal legitimacy. In such a period, it is not possible to straightforwardly define the boundaries of what counts as democratic thought. The theorists who attempt to find and fix definitions of democracy miss the fact that it is the impossibility of finding consensus definitions that defines this crisis. They are on a fool's errand. Fear of authoritarian reforms makes gridlock worse, encouraging localism. In the chronic crisis, we cannot abandon democracy, but we cannot accept it in its current form. We therefore must continue trying to save it with procedural reforms, but our reforms are never enough to address the root causes of the resentment that drives the crisis. To make things worse, we don't agree on what reforms are needed. Our disagreements are so intense that we often think other people's reforms are authoritarian. When hope fails to induce us to participate in politics, the fear of authoritarianism prevails. Fear of the right causes the left to join forces with the center to protect the status quo, and fear of the left causes the right to join forces with the center to do the same. Gradually, cooperation becomes impossible. Those who cooperate with the other side are thought to be collaborating with authoritarianism. They are denounced as useful idiots, fellow travelers, or worse. The whole political system locks up, and as it locks up, reformers grow more desperate to find a way to get the system to be more dynamic. Faced with an increasingly dysfunctional, heavily gridlocked federal government, reformers increasingly try to work around the federal system. They try to find local solutions to problems. There are both left and right-wing versions of this move. On the left, there are those who hope to build power by increasing the autonomy of U.S. cities or, more radically, through the founding of communes. On the right, there are those who wish to increase the autonomy of state governments, or, more radically, those who seek to live off the grid, outside of the government's influence. These movements might be described as anarchist or libertarian. But our economic problems are irreducibly global in scope. Individual, U.S. cities and states cannot change the structural incentives that drive jobs and investment from place to place. They don't control U.S. trade policy. They cannot negotiate with foreign governments to set minimum standards. It is not easy for them to go their own way on taxes, wages, or regulations. When the federal government cedes power to cities, states, corporations, and individuals, it does nothing to address the real causes of resentment. Instead, the federal government weakens its own power to change the system, while, as Streeck puts it, fobbing off voters by giving the cities and states trivial, meaningless powers. When the federal government cedes ground to the cities and states, it does not strengthen them in any meaningful way. It simply allows them to get into a bidding war with each other over scarce jobs and scarce tax revenue. Oligarchs and corporations therefore have a strong interest in encouraging both the left anarchist and right libertarian movements. The more these movements succeed, the harder it is for the federal government to recover any semblance of the dynamism it once possessed. The American federal government created the global economic system. It wrote the rules. It is perhaps the only government in the world with anything like enough power to change the rules. Even its power may not be enough anymore. If American reformers grow frustrated with the federal government and try to tackle global problems with local institutions, they're sure to fail. But maybe our reformers don't need to solve economic problems if they can produce a new consensus on what democracy means. Can the chronic crisis end? In the second half of this book, we'll look at 3 different ways the crisis could end. 1. Procedural reforms could fail to change the global economic system, but nonetheless succeed in restoring a consensus about the meaning of democracy. 2. Failed efforts both to change the global economic system and restore consensus could produce a democracy built around despair. 3. This book could be wrong, and there could still be some way to use our existing democratic procedures to address resentment directly. These 3 ways of ending the crisis are the focal points of chapters 4, 5, and 6, respectively.